And now a hearing on U.S. trade enforcement priorities, including dairy trade with Canada, intellectual property protections, and the loopholes used by other countries to avoid tariffs. The House Ways and Means Subcommittee held the meeting. It's 2.5 hours.
Subcommittee will come to order. Thank you to the subcommittee members and witnesses for joining us today for our first Trade Subcommittee hearing of the 119th Congress. I anticipate this will be a busy Congress for the subcommittee to complement a rigorous trade agenda for the executive branch. I would also like to acknowledge Congresswoman Linda Sanchez from California, our new subcommittee ranking member. And I look forward to continuing bipartisan efforts on the subcommittee with you. Now turning to the topic of today's hearing, American trade enforcement priorities. On his first day in office, President Trump laid out a strong vision for our nation's trade policy through the America First Trade Policy Memorandum. This vision builds on the many successes of President Trump's first term, and after 4 years of inaction, I'm confident we can work together to right the ship. For too long, American businesses, workers, farmers, and ranchers have faced an unlevel playing field. Yet the previous administration refused to take the enforcement action needed to protect American interests, which is why I was glad to see strong and strategic trade enforcement featured prominently on day one of the new administration. I appreciate the administration established a deliberative process to incorporate congressional and stakeholder feedback into the American trade agenda. This is precisely why we are holding this hearing today, to ensure a bipartisan opportunity to outline and clearly demonstrate congressional trade enforcement priorities while the Trump administration reviews and analyzes key trade enforcement issues. Effective enforcement starts with using all the tools at our disposal to ensure fair treatment for American products, including the enforcement tools established in our trade agreements. Because of President Trump's vigorous engagement on trade and successful negotiations during his first term, the Biden administration inherited 2 new agreements with strong enforcement mechanisms: the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, and the Economic and Trade Agreement with China, often known as Phase 1 Agreement. Unfortunately, the Biden administration declined to enforce the China Agreement entirely and had a mixed record of success in enforcing USMCA. For instance, China did not fulfill its structural or purchase commitments for U.S. agriculture products and faced no consequences. Under USMCA, American energy and mining companies faced continued discriminatory treatment in Mexico and, in some cases, outright expropriation. The Biden administration filed a request for consultations related to many concerning energy issues under USMCA's dispute settlement mechanism in July 2022, which I supported. However, the Biden administration never took additional steps to pursue this dispute. In some cases, the Biden administration actively worked to undermine the interests of U.S. companies facing expropriation. Similar enforcement challenges were also seen with Canada. USTR failed to effectively enforce U.S. rights regarding dairy market access, and it took months of bipartisan urging for the USTR to challenge Canada's discriminatory digital services tax. However, this challenge, like so much under the administration's passive trade posture, languished in consultations. We must recognize enforcement delays, particularly with key partners like Canada and Mexico, not only hinder market certainty for domestic industries, but also embolden trading partners to take similar actions. When Mexico provided the United States with ample warning of their intentions to restrict U.S. biotech corn exports, it was met with slow-walked complacency. While the dispute panel eventually ruled in our favor, I am disappointed it took 4 years when immediate engagement by the Biden administration could have prevented the policy from ever going into place. Standing up for science-driven, rules-based trade requires a sense of urgency, and I am concerned the previous administration's record of undermining or delaying enforcement will not only lead to similar issues under USMCA, but also encourage other countries to follow suit. Contrast this with the first Trump administration, which alongside many other enforcement initiatives took swift and decisive action using Section 301 against the digital services taxes proposed by France and other nations. Just last week, the President announced discriminatory policies would continue to be a focus of his enforcement policies during the current term. On digital trade issues, This administration will not stand by as foreign governments, including allies and partners like the EU, Canada, and Korea, attempt to regulate American innovators out of existence. Each of these markets has enacted or proposed regulatory measures specifically aimed at imposing massive fines and regulations on our companies. Our closest partners should not be allowed to target our businesses. Creating an environment where American businesses can thrive and continue developing world-leading products and services doesn't end with digital trade. Giving our partners a pass on unjustified practices such as the TRIPS waiver expansion can have a chilling effect on advancements in many fields, not the least being healthcare. Strong IP rules and enforcement are essential for fostering innovation, economic growth, and prosperity. But U.S. companies must operate and compete in countries with weak IP protections. To combat this, USTR should take an active role in ensuring foreign governments respect and safeguard American innovation or face real consequences for failing to do so. There is no shortage of issues to discuss today, and I certainly look forward to a robust conversation. I now recognize the Ranking Member, Ms. Sanchez, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here with you for the first time as Ranking Member. And thank you to our witnesses who have taken the time to be with us today. This committee appreciates your time as we try to make sense of this administration's trade policies. Though it seems to boil down to threats, a lot of tariffs, and an insatiable hunger for revenue to pay for huge tax cuts for the rich. At the top, I want to put to rest the myth that foreign countries pay for tariffs. Let's set the record straight. American families pay for tariffs in the form of higher costs for goods and services. For example, the President's new tariffs on goods like pharmaceuticals and lumber will increase housing and drug costs for the average American. The President shouldn't burden working families by misusing tariffs to deal with every foreign policy disagreement that he has. Let me be clear, tariffs are an important tool in trade policy. They can help level the playing field for domestic industries, but they cannot be our whole trade policy. While I've heard a lot about tariffs from the President, I have not heard how they will be paired with investments to onshore manufacturing and create jobs. If we care about workers who've been displaced by trade, where is the funding for trade adjustment assistance? Or are these tariffs just an excuse to fund new tax cuts for the Elon Musks of the world? Today's hearing ostensibly is about enforcement. The President talks a big game about enforcement, but you can't just say you want enforcement. You have to fund it. You have to put your money where your mouth is. Every day we hear about thousands of federal workers being illegally fired. How do we enforce the laws if we've lost our enforcement capability? And what about the businesses and workers who depend on those agencies to assess dumping and countervailing duties, to protect IPR rights, to hold countries to their environmental commitments, and to combat forced labor? The President's first trade action, the America First Trade Policy Memo, proposed reviews due April 1st that may guide new enforcement actions. However, the President's reckless approach meant he couldn't even stick to his own plan and wait for the review. Instead, he immediately threatened massive tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and Colombia. In each case, the President's use of economic coercion against our allies hasn't been to solve trade issues, but to further his inhumane anti-immigrant agenda. Meanwhile, he imposed only a 10% tariff on China, far less than the 60% he promised in his campaign. He also walked back his promise to close the de minimis loophole for China. What changed? China certainly hasn't stopped exporting fentanyl or stealing intellectual property. This begs the question, is he flip-flopping on his policies because his billionaire friends have investments with China? Mr. Chairman, I agree our trade policy needs a serious review. For too long, our policies assumed a rising tide would lift all boats. However, too many working families are not staying afloat. China has fundamentally changed the trading system, and many of our trade policies have hurt American workers and American industry. But the answer isn't to build walls around our country. We must invest in our communities and protect industries from predatory trade practices like China's. This will require us to work with our allies, not against them. This takes thoughtfulness, not chaos and threats that we have seen from the President. This committee cannot stand by as the executive branch runs roughshod over the Constitution and raises prices for all Americans. I hope this hearing marks a renewed mission for this body to craft thoughtful trade policy and reclaim our constitutional prerogatives. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Now, the pleasure of introducing our witnesses for today's hearing. Ambassador Greg Dowd is President and CEO of National Milk Producers Federation. He was the Chief Agriculture Negotiator at USTR during President Trump's first term. Ambassador Jeffrey Garish is partner at Chagrin Associates. He was Deputy USTR during President Trump's first term. Jonathan McHale is Vice President at Computer and Communications Industry Association. Kevin Rosenbaum is Executive Director at International Intellectual Property Alliance. And Greta Peisch is a partner at Wiley Ryan, LLP. She was General Counsel at USTR during the Biden administration. Welcome all, and thank you for sharing your insights here today. Your written statement will be made a part of the record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks. I would add that once you see that yellow light, if you could bring the flight in for a smooth landing quickly, we would appreciate that. Ambassador Dowd, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Greg Dowd, and I am proud to be here as President and CEO of the National Milk Producers Federation. NMPF is the voice for America's dairy farmers and cooperatives here in Washington. Having served as USTR Chief Ag Negotiator in the previous Trump administration, as well as senior professional staff for the agricultural trade issues on the Senate Ag Committee, I know firsthand how critical exports are for American agricultural industries. This is especially true for the U.S. dairy community. Last year, American dairy producers exported more than $8 billion in dairy products overseas, equivalent to 18% of total U.S. milk production. Much of that success is directly attributable to existing U.S. trade agreements, which have helped U.S. dairy exports increase by roughly $7 billion in the past 20 years. In fact, we run a dairy trade surplus with each of our bilateral trade deal partners. We have reached these heights despite being forced to operate at a significant disadvantage to our international competitors. For well over a decade now, while the European Union and New Zealand have been successfully negotiating trade agreements with key dairy importing countries, the U.S. has not kept pace. In addition to pursuing greater market access, Congress and the administration have a responsibility to work together to enforce existing U.S. trade agreements. Trade enforcement is not a matter of political or legal technicalities. We have seen that inadequate enforcement has real-world consequences by restricting opportunities for American farmers. While we proudly export products to all corners of the globe, there are 4 regions that are of particular economic importance to the U.S. dairy industry when it comes to trade enforcement. The first is North America. Roughly 44% of total U.S. dairy exports, worth about $3.7 billion, are shipped to our nearest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. While Mexico has largely been a positive trading partner, Canada has not. Unfortunately, Canada has a long history of attempting to undermine previously agreed-to market access, a trend that has continued under USMCA. Through manipulative tariff rate quota policies and a systemic circumvention of USMCA's dairy protein export disciplines, Canada has cheated U.S. exporters out of the market access benefits promised to them under the agreements and has tried to dispose of growing volumes of artificially low-priced dairy protein into global markets. The 2026 USMCA review represents a critical opportunity to ensure Canada reforms these underhanded practices. Second, we have the European Union. The scale of our trade deficit with the EU is truly staggering. EU dairy producers export $3 billion worth of products to the United States, while U.S. dairy producers export $167 million in dairy products to the EU. In fact, the U.S. exports 15 times more cheese to Guatemala last year than to the entire European Union. While we continue to face a moving target in exporting dairy to Europe, the U.S. lets European exporters reach our market smoothly and without much scrutiny. If the lack of market access for U.S. agricultural products wasn't enough, the EU has abused geographic indication rules over the past decade to target food and beverage products. By banning American producers from using common names like Parmesan and Feta, the EU has essentially prohibited us from selling our products into Europe, as well as in key export markets where the EU has negotiated protections for its illegitimate GIs. This is an unsustainable disparity that requires a fundamental reset. The third priority is ensuring that China upholds its end of the 2020 Phase 1 trade agreement that was negotiated during the first Trump administration. While the agreement has been an overall benefit to U.S. dairy, we are counting on the U.S. government to further negotiate with China to increase their purchases of U.S. dairy products by facilitating trade with lower tariffs, protection for common names, and timely approval of U.S. dairy manufacturing facilities. Finally, I would like to touch on India, which has used high tariffs and unscientific certification requirements to block most U.S. dairy exports since 2003. Should Congress reauthorize the GSP program, we urge USTR to ensure India meets its market access obligations under the program prior to restoring any GSP benefits to India. We were encouraged by the President's executive order on an American First trade policy, which sets the stage for new bilateral or sectoral agreements, and by the prospect of using his fair and reciprocal plan to address the steep dairy trade imbalance with the EU. Looking forward, we ask that Congress and the administration continue to pursue this goal and strike new trade deals that cut tariffs and tackle non-tariff trade barriers. We are hopeful that the U.S. government will take this dynamic as a challenge to stand up for U.S. dairy producers and the U.S. agriculture. Thank you again for your time and the opportunity to testify before you here today, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next, Ambassador Garish, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the trade enforcement priorities of the United States. During the first Trump administration, I had the privilege to serve as the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and industrial competitiveness. That experience in my time in private practice representing American companies and workers fighting against unfair trade have demonstrated vividly the need for strong trade enforcement to protect the economic and national security interests of the United States. Countries around the world engage in trade policies and practices that harm American companies, workers, farmers, ranchers, and innovators, both here in the United States and in export markets. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss the trade issues we face with all of our trading partners as the hearing proceeds, but I will focus my opening remarks on China. The problems we face with China and the threat they pose to the national security and long-term competitiveness of the United States cannot be overstated. China has used a range of unfair and market-distorting trade policies and practices, including huge subsidies, forced labor, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and currency manipulation to achieve its objective of dominating important sectors of the global economy. In industries like steel, aluminum, chemicals, and solar, China has repeatedly followed its playbook of massively subsidizing its industries, creating enormous excess capacity and flooding global markets with its products. In the first Trump administration, we made important progress in reversing the failed trade policies of the past and correcting our unfair and imbalanced trade relationship with China. The key piece of this was the tariffs imposed on U.S. imports of Chinese goods under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. The Section 301 tariffs have led to a significant improvement in the terms of trade between the United States and China. The U.S. trade deficit in goods with China has dropped by over 21% since the tariffs were imposed, and China's share of U.S. imports has fallen significantly. We were also successful in negotiating the Phase 1 trade agreement with China. The agreement contains binding and enforceable requirements for China to make significant structural reforms in the areas of intellectual property, technology transfer, agriculture, financial services, and currency and exchange rate practices. While the lack of transparency in China makes it difficult to conduct a full assessment of China's compliance, it appears that China has failed to abide by the requirements of the agreement in a number of areas cutting across each of the chapters of the agreement. The U.S. Trade Representative will be conducting a review of China's compliance with the Phase 1 trade agreement as one of the actions under the America First trade policy memorandum issued by President Trump. If the USTR determines that China has violated the agreement, the United States should use the agreement's strong enforcement mechanism to take swift action. That action should include the imposition of additional tariffs on imports from China. We also need a range of other ambitious trade actions to address the threat that China poses. One such action is for Congress to revoke China's permanent normal trade relation status. Granting PNTR to China was a colossal mistake, and American workers and companies have paid the price for it. The time has come for that mistake to be corrected. Congress should also strengthen U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws to improve trade remedy enforcement, including by passing the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. Among other improvements, this legislation would direct the Department of Commerce to countervail cross-border subsidies provided by a government in one country to a recipient in a third country, and would address situations like China's Belt and Road Initiative. It would also streamline successive trade remedy investigations that often become necessary when Chinese companies shift operations to a third country to evade duties. In addition, we should close the de minimis loophole that allows Chinese imports to escape duty liability. Any imports subject to higher duty levels, including those subject to Section 301 tariffs, should be excluded from de minimis eligibility. Finally, we need to expand our efforts to address the duty avoidance practices Chinese companies employ that undermine the effectiveness of our trade enforcement actions. Among other steps, the Enforce and Protect Act should be applied to the evasion of Section 301 and Section 232 duties. Failing to address China's economic aggression will bring enormous long-term costs in the continued offshoring of jobs and industries, the loss of our technological and military superiority, and economic dependence on China. China's ambitions pose an existential threat to the United States, and a comprehensive trade enforcement agenda is essential to counter that threat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next, we have Mr. McHale. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jonathan McHale, and it is my pleasure to provide comments as the committee examines enforcement priorities with respect to international trade. The Computer and Communications Industry Association is an international membership association representing the broader digital services industry. Our members rely heavily on open global markets, which support hundreds of billions of dollars in domestic investments and hundreds of thousands of American jobs. In the digital sector alone, access to foreign markets generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually for the U.S. economy, driving a significant part of the almost $300 billion trade surplus in services that the U.S. enjoys. To sustain these economic investments and ensure continued U.S. economic leadership, maintaining access to foreign markets is absolutely critical. Yet, this goal is increasingly under threat as nations continue to enact discriminatory laws with the primary effect of hurting the U.S. economy. The best response is to deploy empowered trade officials backed by strong congressional support with a primary directive to stand up for U.S. companies and to forcefully push back against egregious trade barriers. Discriminatory trade barriers in foreign markets expand every day. Currently, CCIA is tracking measures in 54 countries across 4 categories, including discriminatory taxation, often referred to as digital services taxes, forced revenue transfers to domestic competitors, asymmetric platform regulation that targets U.S. firms, and data localization and restrictions on cloud computing. To elaborate, digital services taxes, or DSTs, are discriminatory taxes imposed on U.S. firms based on gerrymandered service definitions and revenue thresholds. They cost U.S. companies billions of dollars annually, putting our digital service suppliers at a significant competitive disadvantage in the markets where the taxes are enforced. We count over a dozen countries implementing such taxes, and many more are actively considering them. Notably, our neighbor to the north, Canada, will be the newest country to start implementing a DST starting this coming June. Forced revenue transfers are another discriminatory and extractive policy targeting U.S. firms. The most egregious examples are measures affecting news in Australia, Canada, and Indonesia, measures affecting online video, in Canada and the EU and proposed in Australia, and network usage fees proposed or under consideration in Korea, Brazil, Colombia, and the EU. Asymmetric platform regulation encompasses efforts like the EU's Digital Markets Act that targets leading U.S. companies with brazen rules addressing speculative harms, with the effects that undermine security, stymie innovation, and extract valuable American IP under the guise of promoting competition. These laws, which are designed to apply predominantly to U.S. businesses, cost billions of dollars in compliance and often degrade consumer experience. Other countries are eagerly following suit. Japan is now implementing analogous rules. Turkey, Korea, Australia, and Brazil are considering versions of their own. Data localization severely restricts U.S. companies' ability to offer online services, particularly in a cross-border context, and increases cybersecurity risks to both American and foreign customers. Where U.S. cloud computing companies choose to invest in a foreign market, they are often banned from servicing government or critical infrastructure customers. Key examples include France, Korea, and Mexico. With the unfortunate reality that other countries will continue seeking to hijack the success of U.S. firms, U.S. leadership to push back on these categories of trade barriers is paramount. The economic benefits of digital trade, combined with the cost of inaction, cannot be overstated. To that end, CCI believes that the urgent engagement with trade partners must be a priority. In all cases, forceful use of available trade remedies, including Section 301 or exploration of disincentives based on U.S. domestic tax rules, should be a potential response. These efforts will no doubt signal that other nations should think twice about implementing discriminatory laws that target great companies who provide so much to our economy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McHale. Now recognize Mr. Rosenbaum for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I am Kevin Rosenbaum, the Executive Director of the International Intellectual Property Alliance, the IIPA, a coalition formed in 1984 of trade associations representing the U.S. copyright-based industries, working to improve copyright protection and enforcement abroad, and to open foreign markets closed by piracy and other market access barriers. There is little doubt that U.S. trade agreements have meaningfully contributed to the growth of the copyright industries. For the past 35 years, the IIPA has commissioned a series of studies documenting the contributions of the U.S. copyright industries to the U.S. economy using the most authoritative, publicly available U.S. government statistics. According to the latest study, the core copyright industries added over $2 trillion in value to the U.S. economy and created more than 11.6 million U.S. jobs, or 5.43% of the entire U.S. workforce, with total compensation 50% above national average. Importantly, foreign sales and exports from selected sectors of the U.S. copyright industries have grown from $22.3 billion in 1989 to $272.6 billion in 2023. This is a remarkable story of U.S. export power and growth, one that translates directly into strong U.S. global competitiveness, good U.S. jobs, and growth in the overall U.S. economy. This period of extraordinary growth has occurred across roughly the same time range as the U.S. adoption of numerous bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade agreements. Each of these agreements, from NAFTA in 1994 to its 2020 replacement, USMCA, is designed to open foreign markets to U.S. goods and services dependent on copyright protection, primarily by mandating improved and modernized copyright laws, and in most cases, higher standards for on-the-ground enforcement of these laws. The significance of these agreements cannot be overstated. A 2024 OECD study on services trade observed substantial market access barriers for all services, and that barriers for digitally enabled services, which includes the creative industries, grew by 25% over the past 10 years. The OECD further found that over 30% of the countries covered in its study imposed restrictions on streaming and downloading platforms. U.S. FTAs are one of the very few tools available to improve the creative industry's ability to compete overseas on a level playing field. In addition to opening markets, trade agreements can help forestall efforts to close markets. Since the conclusion of the U.S.-Australia Free Trade Agreement, Australia has several times considered imposition of quotas on the online marketplace. These proposed quotas were rejected in part because they would be inconsistent with Australia's trade obligations, including under OSFDA. Similarly, since the 2004 entry into force of the U.S.-Chile FTA, Chile has several times considered expanding its theatrical screen quota, but this expansion has been consistently stalled in part because it would violate Chile's FTA obligations. As impressive as this progress has been, the copyright industries have not fully benefited from these agreements because of the ongoing failure of many U.S. trade agreement partners to fully implement their agreement obligations. For example, the benefits of the USMCA to the copyright industries have been severely limited because neither Canada nor Mexico have fully implemented it. Canada, despite its USMCA commitments, is advancing implementation of its Online Streaming Act, which conditions market access for streaming services on making financial contributions into certain government-linked funds intended for domestic industry. In Mexico, even after a definitive May 2024 decision by the Mexican Supreme Court upholding the constitutionality of Mexico's 2020 reforms addressing its USMCA copyright obligations, Mexico still has not fully implemented these provisions. Mexico has not introduced implementing regulations, which were required within 180 days of enactment of the reforms and are essential to putting these new laws into practice. It is now well after the Supreme Court's decision, and there is no indication that implementing regulations are forthcoming. China's failure to fully implement the commitments it made in the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement, particularly its services purchasing obligations, has limited the benefits of that agreement to the copyright industries. And in South Africa, IIPA remains concerned with two copyright reform bills that South Africa's President Ramaphosa recently referred to the Constitutional Court. If enacted, these bills would violate South Africa's trade commitments and the eligibility criteria of both GSP and AGOA on intellectual property. In sum, the positive impacts of U.S. trade agreements that open up markets to U.S. goods and services protected by copyright are significant and will remain so, but the full benefits of these agreements will be realized only if U.S. trading partners fully implement them. Thank you for this opportunity to present the views of the IIPA in this important hearing. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenbaum, and now I recognize Ms. Peisch for 5 minutes.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Sanchez, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. Today, I will address the importance of trade enforcement tools and resources, a comprehensive China strategy, and maintaining an across-the-board enforcement agenda. This subcommittee has a track record of creating new enforcement tools, from the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to the groundbreaking Rapid Response Mechanism in USMCA, which have helped to level the playing field for U.S. workers and combat unfair labor practices. Enforcement tools must continue to evolve with the trade challenges facing U.S. manufacturers, farmers, service providers, and workers. The Leveling the Playing Field 2.0 Act, spearheaded by members of this subcommittee, is the next front in combating China's attempts to get around trade remedies. It will enable our industries to counter China's tactics of moving production from one country to another and subsidizing producers in third countries. As this example shows, if we stand still in developing our trade enforcement tools, we move backwards. U.S. industries and workers rely on personnel across the trade agencies to fully enforce trade remedies laws, ensure imports comply with enforcement actions, and combat barriers abroad. Domestic industries filed over 100 anti-dumping and countervailing duty petitions with the Commerce Department and the International Trade Commission last year, nearly double the average annual petitions filed in the last 10 years. Customs and Border Protection collects duties imposed under trade authorities, polices evasion of those duties, enforces forced labor import bans, works to keep fentanyl out of the United States, and implements a host of other laws. USTR is a lean agency with an outsized remit in trade enforcement. All these agencies are stretched thin, and reductions would jeopardize their work on behalf of U.S. industries and workers. With respect to China, this subcommittee has led the way in highlighting how China's non-market policies and practices target key sectors like steel, aluminum, shipbuilding, solar panels, electric vehicles, semiconductors, and batteries. We must use every tool to combat China's practices and their distortive effects, including robust trade enforcement of remedies laws and Section 301. Sector-based Section 301 investigations, such as those initiated by the last administration relating to China's targeting of the maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sector, and the semiconductor industry, can lead to targeted remedies tailored to those practices. China's manufacturing overcapacity displaces producers all over the world, resulting in other countries adopting policies to support industries crushed under the weight of China's supply, further distorting the marketplace. This has become acute as China has doubled down on exporting its way to growth. Instead of walling ourselves off from the rest of the world, we must work with allies and partners to stand up to China's predatory strategies and combat distortions on a global level. A China strategy must also include a smart offensive game plan that targets key U.S. industries for growth and couples it with policies that incentivize moving away from overdependence on supply chains in China. Investments like those in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science Act, and Inflation Reduction Act promise to give the extra boost needed to overcome China's unfair practices, but could be even more targeted to increase U.S. resiliency. An enforcement strategy must have clear and calculated objectives, adapt to challenges across all sectors, and maintain U.S. leadership in international forum. The long-term imposition of tariffs may be appropriate to counter China's entrenched practices, but for the trade barriers that span the 400-plus pages of USTR's annual report, imposing tariffs without a strategy for removing those barriers will not help our industries sell into new markets. Positive results come from changes that trading partners agree to make. Trade tools involving tariffs may be part of the strategy, but they are only a means to an end. An effective enforcement strategy must assert U.S. leadership internationally. China and Europe are adept at using standards bodies and other international rulemaking to their own advantage to the detriment of U.S. industries. The United States needs to be at the table to fiercely advocate for our interests. Being at the table is also critical in the digital trade space. Even as we debate domestic regulation of the digital ecosystem, we must participate in the international discussion as norms and rules are developed. U.S. leadership in the digital economy is too important, and the implications for our future prosperity too great to take a back seat. Finally, the United States must lead at the WTO, which remains an important forum for promoting transparency, raising emerging issues, and coming to collective solutions. It can bring together all members of the global trading system to confront collective trade challenges, such as growing overcapacity in key manufacturing industries, the economic impact of climate change, and the transition to lower carbon economies. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide input into the work of the subcommittee.
Thank you. Thank you again to our entire panel for sharing your insights. It's quite obvious that there's a lot of territory to cover here. Very broad topic, but nonetheless very important. We'll begin by recognizing the full committee chair, Mr. Smith, with his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. China has a long history of engaging in unfair trade practices, and this committee has invested a tremendous amount of time in exposing those activities. Most notably, China's use of our de minimis policy to avoid paying U.S. tariffs. Last Congress, we approved legislation that would have prohibited the use of de minimis on any imports subject to President Trump's 301 tariffs. This would have eliminated the privilege for 70% of Chinese imports. Mr. Garish, imports coming into the country from China under the de minimis policy spiked from 208 million packages in 2018 to more than 640 million in 2023, a 208% increase. There's a lot of evidence that China's abuse of de minimis accelerated to try to evade President Trump's Section 301 tariffs. Without significant reforms, de minimis entries will undermine new tariffs that President Trump imposes this term. Do you agree that reforming de minimis is an urgent priority to further strengthen President Trump's tariff and trade agenda?
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for that question. And I do agree that reforming de minimis is an urgent priority to make sure that our trade enforcement efforts are made as effective as possible. China, as you mentioned, has really abused the de minimis exception that's available here. They account for the vast majority of the imports that come in under the de minimis exception, and it has become a massive loophole in our trade enforcement efforts. We really need to close all of the available loopholes that would undermine the trade enforcement efforts of the Trump administration and of the United States. And I think we should eliminate de minimis eligibility for any products that come in under the various trade enforcement actions that are taken, including Section 301, Section 232, and our other trade enforcement measures as well.
Thank you. President Trump is deploying trade policies to advance an American-first trade agenda that can deliver on multiple fronts, whether it's enhancing our national security, demanding fair treatment for American workers, manufacturers, farmers, or bringing in new revenues to the government. On that last point, President Trump's existing tariffs imposed during his first term on the Chinese imports are already netting roughly $40 billion in additional revenues to the U.S. each year. And of course, President Trump has already added an additional 10% tariff on all imports from China and has announced plans to impose significant additional tariffs. Mr. Garish, given your previous experience working in the Trump administration as a key leader on trade policy, including with respect to China, can you speak to the role that tariffs can play in increasing revenues and how President Trump's commitment to aggressive use of tariffs serves a broader fiscal and economic agenda?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Tariffs can serve a significant role in raising revenue for the United States government. Already, the tariffs that were imposed during the first Trump administration have raised over $260 billion in revenue for the U.S. government. And I think the additional tariffs that could be imposed in the second Trump administration have the prospect of raising potentially hundreds of billions of dollars each year in revenue for the U.S. government. So that is an important feature of tariffs that could be beneficial to the United States. That's over on top of course, the benefits that tariffs have in addressing unfair trade practices, rebalancing our trade relationships, growing manufacturing here in the United States, as well as protecting our national security. But the revenue-raising aspects are an important feature that will, I think, increase as we go along.
Thank you. Enforcement trade tools can protect American workers, manufacturers, and agriculture producers so long as we are willing to use them. The Biden administration had a weak to non-existent enforcement record. Congress had to constantly demand enforcement. We countered Mexico's discrimination against American corn exports, and we'll have to remain vigilant right there. However, numerous issues remain around the world, including Canada's unfair treatment of U.S. dairy products, Thailand's 50% tariff on U.S. beef, the European Union's rejection of many biotech crops through a regulatory process that takes an average of 6 years to just complete, and India's tariff on bourbon, which stood at 150% at the end of the Biden administration and has been reduced to 100% thanks to President Trump's leadership over the last 5 weeks. Mr. Dowd, President Trump will use every tool to aggressively enforce our trade policies, including demanding reciprocity. Where do you see the need for reforms or additional enforcement measures so that Congress and the Trump administration can ensure our farmers and ranchers are treated fairly in our own backyard with Mexico and Canada and globally?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your question. I think for U.S. Dairy's perspective on this is we need to start with Canada and our opportunity here to have another look at USMCA. Canada, on the dairy side of the equation, has been very clever with how they administer their tariff rate quotas. They allocate those to their retailers, which essentially are those that are invested in the Canadian dairy industry, rather than retailers to their processors rather than their retailers and folks that we can sell to in Canada. That's one area. But the other area that I'd really like to address today, if you'll allow me a little bit, is the European Union. We have a $26 billion trade deficit with the EU in agriculture. A little over $3 billion of that is dairy. So we sell 15 times more cheese to Guatemala than we do the EU. Wow. We sell twice as much cheese to Jamaica. We sell more cheese to New Zealand. 5 million people, the other major exporter in the world, than the EU. And they're very clever about how they use certification requirements and non-tariff trade barriers. And this goes back decades across all of agriculture. You know, they make it very clear that they don't want our product. And, you know, we're pretty good ag exporter, 175 billion plus or minus in exports. You know, you have to work pretty hard to run a $26 billion ag trade deficit with us in the U.S.
Those are incredible statistics. One country I'm also particularly concerned about is Brazil, which imposes an 18% tariff on U.S. ethanol, while we impose a tariff of only 2.5% on ethanol from Brazil. Meanwhile, Brazilian exporters game the system to fill almost all of the U.S. global quota for tariff-free beef. This annual quota, meant for trading partners around the world, was filled mostly by Brazilian beef by January 17th. Mr. Dow, do you consider our agriculture relationship with Brazil to be fair and reciprocal?
No, sir. They're a stiff competitor with us. What's interesting on the dairy side of the situation with Brazil is that's almost kind of a cartel down there in terms of dairy production. And in my travels with the USTR, I found it interesting. When U.S. embassy officials return to Brasilia from the U.S., they take cheese with them because there's no product in Brazil that is even comparable. And that's because Brazil blocks our products. I worked on this ethanol issue. Very, very frustrating issue. We did resolve a wheat issue, tariff rate quota issue with Brazil that we'd had for 25 years with them. So it's, you know, Brazil's a stiff competitor, but in agriculture, there should be reciprocity today, sir, and there isn't.
Thank you, Mr. Dowd. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Sanchez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Peisch, Democrats on this committee were adamant during the USMCA renegotiation that the agreement include a strong enforceable mechanism called the Rapid Response Mechanism to promote Mexican workers' freedom of association and to protect the rights of independent unions to negotiate with employers. From your experience at USTR, was the RPM an effective tool, and how can it be used more effectively?
Thank you for the question. The RM was an incredibly effective tool, and the last administration really showed the range and effectiveness of the actions. It brought 27 RM cases across sectors, automotive, garments, mining, benefiting at the end of the day around 36,000 Mexican workers, enabling them to bargain for better work conditions, higher wages, better hours, and freedom of association. Which is, of course, incredibly important for those workers, but more importantly, it benefits our workers here in the United States. Because going abroad from U.S. production, moving to Mexico, should no longer be incentivized by poor working conditions.
That was going to be my follow-up question. Why should American workers here care about workers' rights in Mexico? But it levels the playing field for it so that our workers can compete on roughly equal footing, correct?
Exactly. Ignoring workers' rights should not be a competitive advantage of our trading partners, and the RM is a tool that can remedy that.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Ambassador Garish, last year, de minimis shipments to the U.S. hit a record 1.4 billion packages, mostly from China, entering with minimal inspection and bypassing all duties, including the China 301 tariffs. This de minimis loophole has gutted U.S. manufacturing and retail and facilitated the entry of illegal contraband, including fentanyl, into the U.S., largely inspection-free. Given the high volume of shipments from China, this issue cannot be solved by data collection or targeting alone. Congress needs to act to address this urgent problem. Now, Chairman Smith had asked a similar question, and you had answered that China abuses the de minimis provision. I want you to kind of flush out more how China's abuse of the de minimis exemption has impacted U.S. production, exports, health, and safety?
Thank you, Ranking Member Sanchez. China has, in my view, abused the de minimis exception. I think, first of all, it results in a reduced ability to enforce our trade duties, trade mechanisms that we have, because they are avoiding the payment of all duties when they bring material in under the de minimis exception. So it undermines our trade enforcement efforts, and that cuts across all of the various duties that are applied to imports coming in. So first of all, it undermines our trade enforcement efforts. It also, as you mentioned, is a way for importers to bring in fentanyl. That's a massive problem that we need to act against, and that's been demonstrated time and time again that is a massive problem as well. And it just hinders the ability of U.S. manufacturers to compete with these products just because they're coming under the de minimis threshold. They should not be free of the tariffs and the duties that we've imposed to counteract unfair trade practices that are really intended, in many instances, to level the playing field with our U.S. producers here. So it puts them at a competitive disadvantage as well.
Thank you for that answer. And Ms. Peisch, back to you again. I want to thank you for highlighting in your testimony some of the trade enforcement innovations that have emerged from this committee. I also echo your call for new enforcement tools, including the passing of the bipartisan Leveling the Playing Field 2.0. In your comments, you mentioned some of the tools that have proven effective, including the Peru Forest Sector Annex, the Rapid Response Mechanism, and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You suggested that there may be ways to scale those mechanisms or adapt them to other areas. I just would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that point. How could they be applied to other areas?
Sure. And one thing that those tools have in common is that they are addressing practices that are happening abroad that, again, undermine U.S. companies, U.S. workers, and their competitiveness here. And so there's lots of areas where that can be applied. Taking the rapid response mechanism, which addresses unfair labor practices, failure to enforce labor rights, taking that to other agreements, other markets where there's similar labor challenges, adapting that to environmental standards. When countries fail to enforce environmental standards, not only does that harm the communities and the workers in those countries, but again, it's basically a form of subsidy where a country is allowing a company, a factory to operate under their own standards in order to have that export advantage, to come to our markets without having to bear those costs of cleaning up pollution and keeping their environment safe. So those are just a couple examples.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm out of time. I'll yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. Appreciate all the questions here. We do have a lot to ask. I'm glad to say that I led a letter last year regarding Colombia's countervailing duty investigation into U.S. milk powder exports. Unfortunately, as you know, the Colombians moved ahead by imposing preliminary tariffs with an announcement on the final ruling expected soon. I'm concerned that Colombia's use of politically motivated countervailing duty investigations across commodities, including dairy and ethanol, will actually have copycat effects in other markets. Ambassador Dowd, what actions do you think we should take to push back and certainly send a message that would prevent other markets from trying to make similar moves that, again, undermine the entire process?
Mr. Chairman, we share your concerns, and we haven't heard yet what's coming out of Colombia. Completely agree with you that this is 100% political and driving a domestic situation down there in Colombia. We just have to see what they're going to decide to do and whether the common sense will prevail in this kind of conversation. But for goodness sakes, we have a free trade agreement with Colombia. This is a situation from an enforcement perspective. I think the U.S. government, has been very aggressive, but I think we need to continue to be very aggressive with our trading partners throughout the Western Hemisphere here to help folks understand that you don't solve domestic political issues on the backs of U.S. ag exports and that's exactly what's going on.
Right. Thank you. It's important for the Trump administration to assess commitments upheld and missed, I want to emphasize, in the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement. Among other important issues, there is an opportunity to meaningfully enforce China's patent linkage regime per its commitments under the pact, and also to push for meaningful and enduring resolutions to outstanding market access issues tied to China's poor track record when it comes to approving ag biotech applications. Ambassador Garish, I appreciate your testimony about Phase 1 enforcement priorities across the board. In particular, how should the Trump team address these shortfalls related to patent linkage and market access, especially for ag biotech products, both in the context of the agreement and in the broader bilateral relationship?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. And those two issues that you've mentioned, patent linkage and the ag biotech provisions, were a couple of the most important provisions that we negotiated as part of the Phase 1 agreement with China. On patent linkage, our right holders continue to experience problems with the inability to get early resolution of patent disputes through the patent linkage system. There's a lack of transparency. They are not able to get preliminary injunctive relief, and the relief that they get doesn't last as long as they need it to. And there's a bias being shown for Chinese companies in that process. So it's a major problem. Ag biotech there's similar issues, similar problems. That was a massive issue in the negotiations. It's been a long-standing problem for the United States. Again, there's a lack of transparency. We did agree to have them implement a science-based process with transparency. They're simply not doing it, and our companies are not getting the approvals that, and our farmers and ranchers are not getting the approvals that they should be getting through that process. And the process is also taking much longer than it should, and much longer than they agreed to take. And they're also requiring information that's just not relevant to the use of the products that are at issue there. So we have a very strong enforcement mechanism that we spent a lot of time negotiating in the Phase 1 trade agreement. We can bring disputes and resolve them within roughly 90 days, and then the United States has the ability to take unilateral action to determine whether there's been a violation, and if so, what action to take. That mechanism should be used by this administration. It should be used by future administrations, and to take action to enforce the commitments that China made in the Phase 1 agreement.
Sure. I appreciate that. I think we all know that property rights, in this case IP, intellectual property, is a contrast between China and the U.S. in terms of long-held principles and the rule of law and so forth. So I just think with developing technology, it's key that we stay on top of this, which leads me to the next topic. You know, we saw the previous administration take a position on intellectual property in Geneva relating to the TRIPS waiver that I fear really sends a horrible message to the development, further development of intellectual property across industries. So it's not just pharmaceuticals. That, you know, the message of we should encourage investments, not discourage investments. And so then we see other intellectual property rights being violated in China. Certainly, I think Mr. Rosenbaum knows a lot about this. But Mr. Rosenbaum, how would you say we should reassert our global leadership on IP, broadly speaking, in this new era of enforcement, where I think we've already seen more engagement, both bilaterally and perhaps through multilateral organizations?
Thank you. Thanks very much for that question. It is important for the U.S. to reassert leadership in promoting strong IP protections and enforcement abroad. That has historically been the case. The U.S. led the way in incorporating IP protections into the GATT in the form of the TRIPS agreement. The United States has historically recognized IP as integral to economic and cultural growth, and recognized the harm from foreign markets that don't adequately protect and enforce intellectual property. I noted the major contributions to the U.S. economy in my opening statement from the copyright industries. But it's also, I think, important to recognize that this is not just in the U.S. interest. Promoting strong copyright protection and enforcement actually benefits foreign countries as well. Most every foreign country has some form of a creative industry. The WIPO has looked at this. They've done studies, over 50 studies, I think, looking at countries developing and developed, and found significant contributions from local creative industries. So, so this is a huge benefit, not just to U.S. stakeholders, but all around the world. The U.S. should take leadership here. And so, for example, it's critical for the U.S. To remain a leader in multilateral talks on advancing pro-IP positions at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and the World IP Organization. A leadership vacuum creates opportunities for anti-IP voices, such as China. In that regard, IIPA welcomes the nomination of Joseph Barloon as Deputy USTR to lead those efforts. The United States at the WTO, one issue that should be taken up is supporting further extension of the WTO e-commerce moratorium. This is to prevent customs duties on electronic transmissions. Countries such as India and Indonesia have threatened to allow the moratorium to expire and to put duties on digital copyrighted works, which would be a significant problem for the U.S. creative industries. I believe the administration's recent memo addressed this and called on USTR to look at tools to make the e-commerce moratorium permanent. The U.S. should take leadership before WIPO, the World IP Organization, and ensure that WIPO is maintaining its mission to promote intellectual property rights, where sometimes it has veered off course. WIPO should be encouraged to dedicate resources to promote the full implementation of the WIPO Internet treaties, which provide fundamental protections for copyrighted works in the digital environment. And they've been around for 30 years and should be fully implemented by all signatories. And bilaterally, the U.S. should use all available trade tools to ensure that our trading partners are meeting their commitments on IP. This includes enforcement of existing trade agreements on IP, robust engagement through the Special 301 process, and ensuring countries that are eligible for our trade preference programs meet the criteria on intellectual property rights. So, the U.S., there's a lot they can do the U.S. can do to take leadership here.
Yeah. Thank you. And just briefly, moving forward here, Ambassador Dowd, next year, sunset USMCA. It's a unique provision, historically speaking. I think it's a good opportunity as well. Can you explain, perhaps, if you might, how you plan to proceed from your perspective and what would be beneficial for other industries as well? But how do you plan to approach that next year with the sunset?
With regard to Canada and dairy, or just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, Congressman, it's a negotiation. So we have to re-enter the conversation and say, look, you're not meeting the intent and the letter of what we negotiated the first time around with regard to tariff rate quota allocations. You're very cleverly pigeonholing the TRQ, and then you say, no, well, nobody used it, then we can do away with it. It's very cleverly done, but that was not the intent. This was the first dispute that was taken under USMCA and the new disputes process. We don't agree with how the panel came out on this. There was a lot of disagreement, I think, with how the panel came out on this with regard to USTR. So this is an open-ended conversation that we have to close. We also have a situation where Canada has a closed system like our sugar program in terms of dairy up there. And so as their butter consumption increases, they produce more milk to meet the butter. The byproduct is skim milk powder, and when we were entering into these negotiations, they were selling skim milk powder from Canada cheaper than we can sell it into Mexico, cheaper than we could sell it from Arizona into Mexico. So clearly something was a little off there. And so we discussed with them how to, dispense of this Class 7 and how they had adjusted their system. Well, they were very clever in how they did this. Oh, yeah, we'll meet that, but well, now we'll hide it in a new Class 4B. So they've just, pardon the pun, but they've moved the cheese on us here. And so we have to have another conversation about, what is the right way to do this that meets the letter of what they agreed to.
Right. Thank you. I think we can expect a robust exchange moving forward in 2026 on USMCA. And I recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, lady, ma'am, excuse me. Thanks to all of you for being here, and I definitely appreciate your testimony. More importantly, I appreciate the fact that we're actually talking about the T word, not tariffs, but actually talking about trade, which I think is very, very important, something I hope we do more going forward, but also not just talk about it, actually act on it would be actually pretty refreshing, especially here in Congress. So look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, on that. All of your testimony has made clear that this is a time in which it's very important to have mechanisms in place to ensure that companies and countries play by the rules. As we saw with the bipartisan USMCA, comprehensive free trade agreements with strong enforcement mechanisms really are the gold standard when it comes to trade enforcement. But that means that aggressive trade enforcement requires aggressive deal making. And I'm not talking about frameworks, I'm talking about agreements. Furthermore, while processes like 301 and 201 offer tariffs and duties as a response to unfair practices, they do little to help American exporters receive fair treatment in foreign markets. And although you have a stalemate at the WTO, it is the dispute resolution process within free trade agreements that bring governments to the table and eventually change policies, at least we hope so. Now, USMCA included improved state-to-state resolution procedures as well as the rapid response mechanism, really kind of a first-of-its-kind labor enforcement mechanism. So far, the processes in the USMCA actually have been used to address a number of labor practice issues, to address Mexico's treatment of corn, and to change Canada's dairy quotas, though there is a lot more to be done. Got it. Understood. And I agree with the Ranking Member that this administration has got to do more than just talk about tariffs, but I also admit that I was disappointed in the last administration's reluctance to negotiate substantive free trade agreements. It didn't initiate or even ask Congress for trade promotion authority. Instead, the Biden administration launched IPEF and the US-EU Trade Technology Council, which didn't include traditional trade provisions and were never even finished. I get that these frameworks laid a foundation, but as Mr. LaHood heard me say last week when we traveled together, they were like a hamburger without the meat. It's actual agreements that provide the meaty protections for farmers and to open up new markets. And we could have done more, but going forward, let's do more. We must do more when it comes to trade and trade agreements. Now, at the same time, I am also disappointed with the tariffs threatened and levied by the current administration. These tariffs absolutely undermine the trade enforcement mechanisms that we've established under USMCA, especially makes it difficult for negotiators going into USMCA review in 2026. How do we expect our partners to trust or use trade enforcement procedures if the model we set is to ignore those options and to use tariffs kind of as a shoot now, aim later type of process? Not only are these tariffs damaging to the economy, but they also undermine the confidence that trading partners have in the United States and make it more difficult to establish strong procedures to address legitimate concerns going forward. The Trump administration has stated that it is interested in new free trade agreements. I really hope that's true. But going forward, I hope to see the U.S. Trade Representative, who I've only heard good things about, by the way. I've heard he's a straight shooter, and I hope he continues to work with us here in the United States Congress. But I also hope he's bolder about working with Congress to leverage our market power for free trade agreements that bring clear and enforceable standards. Mr. Rosenbaum, if I could hit you with my first question with only a minute left, unfortunately. How could more free trade agreements with strong enforcement provisions improve trade enforceability, especially going into the USMCA review in 2026, and how it can strengthen enforcement for provisions dealing with copyright issues? If you could sum that up, because I got one more question for Ambassador.
Thanks. Yeah, really quick. I mean, trade agreements, as you say, are the gold standard for putting into place high standard copyright protections and enforcement, with an enforcement mechanism, and are really the best tool to get countries to increase their protection and enforcement of copyright.
Outstanding. 30 seconds, Ambassador Dowd. Good to see you back up on Capitol Hill. Appreciated your work and look forward to continuing to work with you if possible. Elaborate a little bit more. In light of the USMCA review in 2026 and the future trade agreements, how can we structure dispute resolution procedures to be faster acting?
Well, that was a big topic of conversation with Ambassador Mahoney in USMCA was how do you have enforcement at the speed of commerce and you don't languish on these things for years? Do I think what we did in Canada and dairy was adequate in terms of timeline and process? Yeah, you could argue that. Was the outcome correct? No. And so there's that component of it too. Is the speed is one issue, getting it correct is the other issue. So there's a lot of elements of this. What we do appreciate the fact, though, that we do have, I agree with the comment of a gold standard enforcement mechanism now for the very first time, at least, and hopefully we can continue that in other agreements.
Thank you. And before I yield back, just want to talk about briefly getting rid of Jackson Vanik for Kazakhstan and hopefully having a PNTR for that country, which would be economically, trade-wise, and strategically beneficial for all parties involved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. I now recognize Mr. Buchanan for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to thank the chairman for doing this today. And let me just add on to my friend from California about free trade agreements. We've done little or nothing, frankly. And I've been to, there's 200 countries, 180 countries. I've been to 80 of them in the world. And a lot of them, not all of them, and some we wouldn't want, but would like to be involved with some kind of a trading relationship, which leads to a lot of friendships and security issues and a lot of other things. We're not out on the playing field, and we haven't been for some time. I was kind of headed up trade for a period of time and been on the trade committee for a long time. We need to be more active and engaged in this. So, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding an important hearing on trade enforcement priorities. Over the last few years, weak trade enforcement has empowered countries to take advantage of the United States, significantly challenging our small businesses and our farmers. Within the state of Florida, we have seen firsthand the harmful effects of this through Mexico's illegal seasonal dumping of fruits and vegetables within the ag industry. Mexico's agreement of dumping of tomatoes results in an economic loss about $4 billion a year to Florida's economy, along with $2 billion lost in sales every year. And it's also impacted 30,000 jobs in our state. Ambassador Garish, let me ask you, with you look at $4 billion, that wasn't the intent of these agreements when we put them together. It was to have something that worked for everybody, the free trade agreement with Mexico. And yet, I'd say over 20 years, even before I got in Congress, people have been concerned about what's going on with Mexico. We worked, I thought, in good faith, but where is the enforcement? It just seems like, you know, you do all the work, took time, a lot of heavy negotiation. You know that better than anybody because you worked with Ambassador Lighthizer. But what do we got to do to enforce these agreements? Because as far as I'm concerned, agreements are only as good as the people involved. But what's your suggestion as it relates to that on the enforcement side? Here you are 6 years ago, and you look at these numbers just in Florida are huge, but probably across the country in a lot of different industries as well.
Thank you, Congressman. And I agree with you. Agreements are only as good as the people involved and the willingness to use the enforcement mechanisms that are available under the agreements. And I think this issue with seasonal and perishable goods is something that's been a problem. And I think under the new administration, I would expect that there would be a review of what can be done under the USMCA to address this problem. I think they will be very willing to use the enforcement mechanism available under the agreement as well as our other agreements that we have with various countries around the world. The other thing I would say is I think we need to have changes to the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws to address the problems that exist with the dumping and subsidization of seasonal and perishable goods and the ability to get relief under our laws. This has been a perennial problem. There's deficiencies in the law that prevent our growers from being able to take action under the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, and I think that should be addressed.
Yeah, and then let me just throw out to you also, why is it that we're not more aggressively in terms of doing agreements and talking about people doing agreements? I thought we had a lot of momentum coming off USMCA, and yet there's been little or nothing on both sides, frankly. And I really do think it makes a big difference, but am I missing something?
Well, I think we can enter into trade agreements which will work for both countries, but particularly for our U.S. companies and farmers and ranchers in terms of opening export markets. I think largely those would have to be on a bilateral basis. I think those would provide the greatest advantages and prospects for the United States. We certainly in the first Trump administration looked for opportunities to do deals with countries. We did an agreement, a trade agreement with Japan, which it greatly expanded our market access for agricultural products. In fact, achieved, I think, most of what we would have achieved under TPP. We also did a digital trade agreement with Japan. We were negotiating free trade agreements with the UK and Kenya.
Let me just mention one of the things. I just got a couple of minutes. Japan, that was a great agreement. Then phase one, there's a phase two. I don't know where that's at. But the point is, the other thing is in Europe. I look at so many Switzerland that talk to them. They love to do something. The UK. We got a lot of the same values, shared values, a lot of the same challenges in terms of wages, this, that, or whatever. And it just seems like that's a great opportunity to make a big difference as well. So I just think we got to get back into the business. We're not in it. We're not sincere about being in it. And we need to change that. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'll recognize Ms. Del Bene from Washington State.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for your time being with us here today. We're here today talking about trade enforcement, but we really should also be talking about Constitution enforcement. President Trump is abusing executive power, including by attempting to impose the largest tax increase in a generation on the American people through tariffs without a vote in Congress. He is ignoring Congress and the Ways and Means Committee, and it appears my Republican colleagues are just standing by. The American people are depending on Congress to stand up. Tariffs and trade are hugely impactful to industries and households in every district across the country. Trade can bring down prices for families and create local good-paying jobs by opening new markets to sell our goods overseas. But the sweeping, broad-based tariffs that President Trump is proposing will hurt our economy by raising the cost of living for the average household by thousands of dollars a year. Trump's plan to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China with emergency powers will increase costs for American households by over $1,200 per year. And his reciprocal tariff plan will cost households an additional $2,700 to $3,400 per year. Low and middle income earners, including farmers, will be the hardest hit, and that's a fact. According to USDA, and I know the chairman talks about this regularly, Nebraska's 3rd congressional district, which Chairman Smith represents, has over 60,000 farmers, more than any other district in the country. Congresswoman Fishbach's Minnesota district has the 2nd most farmers with over 50,000. Congressman Fenstra's Iowa district has the 3rd most farmers. But what is being done to protect farmers? Are we not concerned about the massive retaliation against our farmers that a trade war brings? It always impacts agriculture. Are my colleagues, my Republican colleagues in particular, going to allow President Trump to raise taxes on the American people without a say? That should be the job of this committee. The Constitution is very clear about this. Congress, not the president, has the power to impose taxes and tariffs and to regulate foreign commerce. That is one of the basic functions of the Ways and Means Committee. And my Republican colleagues used to agree with this back when there was a Democrat in the White House. In 2023, Chairman Jason Smith said that President Biden's trade initiatives sidestep Congress, and that the Biden administration, quote, unfortunately has refused to recognize that the Constitution requires Congress be at the center of U.S. trade policy, end quote. He further stated, in order to succeed, the administration must recognize that Congress is in the driver's seat in setting priorities and deciding whether to approve any trade agreements. Yet, if the president's 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico go through, the president would be, in effect, withdrawing the United States from the bipartisan USMCA trade agreement that Congress overwhelmingly approved of. In a 2022 op-ed, Trade Subcommittee Chairman Adrian Smith said, quote, "A successful trade agenda will require close cooperation with Congress every step of the way. This coordination is not optional," end quote. Yet there has been absolutely zero coordination with Congress on trade under the Trump administration. President Trump has already drastically abused the law when he announced tariffs under emergency powers and clearly violated the statute by not, as the law requires, consulting with Congress before exercising any emergency powers. Over the past few years, I have sent letters with Congressman LaHood denouncing then Trade Ambassador Tai's digital trade overreach. I signed on to a letter led by Congressman Ferguson criticizing Treasury for changing taxes on people's health plans without going through Congress, and joined my Republican colleagues in calling out President Biden for signing a trade deal with Japan on critical minerals without congressional approval. President Trump's tariff proposals dwarf Biden's in terms of the potential economic impacts. Where is the outrage now? Last year, when President Biden signed a trade deal with Taiwan, we worked together as a committee to ratify that agreement. And when the bill passed, Chairman Jason Smith stated, "What's particularly encouraging about this legislation is that it represents a bipartisan effort to reassert Congress's constitutional authority." I hope that Republicans still have an interest in reasserting Congress's authority. If so, I'd welcome the chance to work together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. LaHood for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for your valuable testimony today. Ambassador Dowd and Ambassador Garish, welcome back. Thanks for your prior service, and thanks for this really impactful conversation today on trade. I want to address my comments regarding digital trade. I'm the current co-chair of the Digital Trade Caucus, and I've become alarmed by the growing spread of restrictive and oftentimes discriminatory digital regulatory frameworks and laws which have a direct negative impact on U.S. competitiveness. And Mr. McHale, in your opening, you addressed a number of these issues. During President Trump's first term in office, the United States made great strides in establishing ourselves as a driving force on digital trade, shaping market conditions and ensuring equitable competition. We now understand that digital trade is no longer a niche segment of our economy. It is a fundamental pillar of economic strength and global influence. And I would point to the digital trade chapters of USMCA and what we're able to put in there, really the gold standard in terms of requirements and standards and regulations put in place that help for the future as it relates to digital trade. Our leadership in setting fair and effective rules for digital trade went the wrong direction, in my view, over the last 4 years under the Biden administration. When it came to enforcement, we allowed the Communist Chinese Party to expand its global economic presence and promote digital trade policies that starkly contrast to our American values. We're all familiar with the Digital Silk Road and other initiatives they put in place in this space. Moreover, we've allowed and sometimes even encouraged the implementation of digital services taxes, or DSTs, and other taxes or regulatory frameworks that unfairly targeted U.S. businesses. I commend President Trump for signing an executive order recently to directly address the imposition of DSTs and defend U.S. businesses and workers. That is just the beginning, however, and we in Congress need to find ways to better support our digital trade sector and defend against many of the increasing threats being made to stifle U.S. economic growth. Mr. McHale, again, appreciated your comments in your opening statement. As we look at how do we focus on winning the strategic competition against the CCP, which has to be a priority. I serve on our Select Committee on China, which is a bipartisan group focused on how we win this competition. I think you do that in the economic space. But as I mentioned, I've become concerned over the last 4 years the United States has ceded the playing field to other nations, especially China, by stepping back on digital trade leadership. Could you speak to how increased internet fragmentation, including localization Localized data may benefit Chinese companies such as Huawei, and how should this impact U.S. trade enforcement priorities?
Yes, thank you. Some of the key elements of our digital trade agenda were actually motivated by looking at what were the barriers that China imposed in its market that did prevent U.S. companies from effectively competing there. And so whether it's a data flow rule, whether it's a data localization rule, whether it's access to source code, whether it's discrimination on digital products, those were prevalent measures seen in the Chinese market that really hurt U.S. firms. And so the primary motivation was to make sure that is not replicated in other markets. Maybe we're not going to make a go of it in the Chinese market, but we want to make sure that the Chinese model does not get exported into other regions. I think our trade partners who want the U.S. Companies in their markets and want to engage with them understood that and embraced many of these key provisions. So if you look at a TPP, which the U.S. ended up not joining, but those governments actually integrated those into their own provisions. And so it wasn't just about U.S. Tech companies or U.S. interests. It was really about them seeing it valid for themselves as well. So these are useful rules, and they certainly do serve as a bulwark against some of the Chinese efforts to restrict the data, to force localization, and access intellectual property, for example, source code.
Thank you. I have another question for you related to the EU, but I'm limited on time here. I'll submit that for the record, Mr. McHale. Thank you.
Thank you, and now recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. You know, it's unusual that my Republican colleagues, who traditionally are pro-trade advocates, particularly those from agricultural states, are so eager to support the wide-ranging tariffs that President Trump has proposed on our closest trading partners. I'm sure they know well that farmers and ranchers, and as well as other U.S. exporters, will suffer the most as their goods become subject to foreign retaliatory tariffs. One justification I hear from them is that the tariffs, the tariffs will partially offset the cost of the budget-busting tax cut that we're about to grapple with, tax cuts for the wealthy and the massive corporations. But I would caution them that if you use tariffs as a pay-for, they can be rescinded by executive fiat with no ability for Congress to intervene. So the president, on a whim, can withdraw his tariffs as easily as he imposes them without any pushback from Congress, and that makes our crippling deficits even worse. Another contradictory justification I hear for Trump's tough trade policy is it'll create leverage that we can use to bend foreign trading partners to our will. But if the president wants to raise revenue with tariffs, wouldn't this create an incentive for him not to give in to his deal-making impulses and keep the most destructive tariffs in place? You know, Ambassador Dowd, isn't it true that American agriculture exporters are the very first to be subject to retaliatory tariffs on their goods?
Yeah, we've seen some of that in the past. But Congressman, I think there was a pretty good book written by our previous boss about some of these issues, and that last chapter, I think, is instructive in terms of how other countries try to game us in terms of their currency and their regulatory policy and their fiscal policy. So there are a lot of challenges that we face in our trade relationship with other countries, and quite honestly, the challenge we have in agriculture is everybody in the world's protectionist. Everybody tries to protect their own farmers, and that puts us oftentimes at the front line.
Let me move on, Ambassador. Ms. Peace, do you have any concerns with using tariffs as a major long-term source of revenue? And why do other large economies not rely on tariffs as a revenue source?
Thank you for the question. Generally, tariffs, they're a tool. They're a trade enforcement tool. They're a tool in our statutes with particular goals and aims to change behavior often in other countries, to enforce disputes, to enforce trade remedies, but they have a specific objective. And that isn't to raise revenue. It is to achieve these objectives, to open markets for our companies and to protect our industries here at home who are subject to unfair practices, and it's just not the function in those authorities to raise revenue. That's not the purpose or the legal justification.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. McHale, you've had this long career in USTR, different presidents, different parties. Senator Hawley's indicated that he will soon introduce a resolution to withdraw the U.S. from the WTO. I think this would be a terrible mistake. I think many of my colleagues agree. And it's weird because our objection has always been that the appellate body was what was wrong, and it hasn't been functional for years. That can't be the reason to pull out of the WTO now. Do you think it's still to our advantage to engage with the WTO? What do you think about Senator Hawley's efforts?
I do believe that the WTO does have an important role in a unique forum to pull together so many nations in one place and to be able to address cross-cutting issues. Many of the rules that members adopt under the WTO, these are binding trade commitments, and one can use those rules as a way of ensuring that there is market access in various countries. Even if the dispute settlement system doesn't work, there certainly is a value in having a binding commitment which you can have a conversation with a government about why a certain problem hasn't been addressed that they committed to.
Thank you. Ms. Peace, we're seeing large layoffs in agency after agency after agency. When this hits the ITA and the CBP and the USTR with chaotic and indiscriminate layoffs, how are we ever going to enforce our trade policy?
I think there's a real question whether we will be able to. As I mentioned in my opening statement, these agencies are already overwhelmed because we're seeing greater unfair practices from China, as we've talked about today. We're bringing more trade enforcement cases. The agencies are behind in the statutory deadlines. They're allocating their resources as best as they can, working really hard, but underwater today at our baseline. And so if there's further reductions in those agencies, at CBP, which is keeping out fentanyl, it's finding evasion of our duties, it's addressing health and safety laws. It's a real concern and a real danger for our industries and our consumers.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Murphy, followed by Ms. Sewell, and after Ms. Sewell, we will then proceed to 2-1 based on the numbers present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time. And thank you, guys. I think this is more timely than ever. Obviously, or I would think that 99% of people who are in this country who are just going to work, getting their kids in school, et cetera, have no clue about trade, no clue about how we have been abused, the U.S., in trade practices across this country. And the fact that we have a president now that actually is going to do something about trade, I think is great. Tariffs are in the Constitution. By the way, I just would remind my Democratic colleagues that President Biden, who was the guy in the White House, that he extended some of the Chinese tariffs that were begun in the Trump era, and they are not in the budget bill as a revenue-raising mechanism. So it's not being truthful that we're using them for revenues. I also want to thank our committee chairman, Chairman Smith, for bringing up the issue of de minimis. I think it's critical. China primarily, which is seemingly all what we're trying to do with trade-wise, is abusing that privilege, and I'm glad to see that the attention is being brought to this. I want to bring a little bit of attention to a different issue, and that's transshipment. Unfortunately, transshipment and other means of customs fraud have grown in this country. The relief from unfair trade practices promised to domestic manufacturers by U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders is being undermined by transshipment and other means of fraud that seek to evade them. We need to find creative ways to stop transshipment so we can assure that President Trump's attention to trade is not being undermined. I want to example one highlight from my state. It's actually over in the other part of the state, in Charlotte Pipe and Foundry, which has successfully challenged the unfair trade practice of Chinese producers, resulting in the imposition of significant anti-dumping and countervailing duty remedies. It's sad that they had to do that, but they've had to take this to court. After the imposition of those remedial duties, the foreign producers then have undertaken a complex scheme of shell company exporters and importers from around the region
to obfuscate the origin of their products and evade the AD/CVD duties. Charlotte Pipe is now on its 14th Enforce and Protection Act petition. How much money that each of these companies have to spend in trying to fight the untrade fair practices, primarily from China, is ridiculous. These promised remedies by AD/CVD orders have proven to be out of reach, and the threat to domestic industry remains. Our inability to lawfully enforce imposing anti-dumping and countervailing duties is undermining the utility of U.S. trade laws to domestic producers. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from the American businesses urging Congress to enact improvements to the nation's trade and custom enforcement laws. So be it, he said. I heard him. One of the pieces of legislation endorsed in the letter is H.R. 1284, the Fighting Trades Cheats Act, which I'm an original co-sponsor of. This legislation would increase penalties for customs fraud while supplementing customs to pursue acts of AD/CVD order evasion. Just a couple questions here. Mr. Ambassador Garish, can you discuss how we can address the issue of transshipment so we can ensure that our domestic industries are being adequately protected from unfair trade practices?
Thank you, Congressman. And the problem with transshipment is a major problem and something we absolutely need to address. And your Fighting Trade Cheats Act is something that would be an important addition to to our toolbox that we could use to address the problem with transshipment. There are other important changes that I think we need to make. Some of those are included in the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 legislation that has just been reintroduced as well. Which would enhance the ability to address evasion of anti-dumping and countervailing duties, including transshipment. There's also problems with misclassification of products to evade the duties, and even instances of undervaluing products to try to lower companies' duty liability. So these are all significant problems. Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 would address these as well. It would apply the Enforce and Protect Act to safeguard duties. It would also require certifications of products coming in that they're not subject to anti-dumping or countervailing duties, so could get at this problem as well. It enhances the circumvention provisions that are available to the Department of Commerce. But there's also other improvements we can make to the Enforce and Protect Act. One of them is to make it available across all trade enforcement.
Just if you can wrap up.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Another is to impose certain requirements on companies that try to appeal those decisions, and also allowing customs to, on its own, initiate these proceedings under EPA. So there are changes we should make, and it's an absolutely important problem that we need to address.
Yeah. So, Ms. Peisch, I heard you say there was no ability to enforce our trade laws. And that's a sad fact unless we do it through the courts, and who's going to recognize those? But that's why we're having to do the tariffs that we're having to do. Sadly enough, and I don't believe they should be used as a revenue-generating mechanism. But the time has come for American industry to actually reach back and not have the abuses that other countries place upon it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. The discussion about trade enforcement, I think, is very timely and is bipartisan. I welcome the conversation that we're currently having. Unfortunately, like most of this administration's actions thus far, the President is overreaching his authority and the law to implement blanket, untargeted tariffs. This is not what Congress intended with authorities granted in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. I think that the President's actions are causing more chaos and confusion than they are being helpful, and they're jeopardizing very important trade relationships with our allies and trusted trading partners. Make no mistake, these indiscriminate tariffs will pass cost on to the American consumers, taxing our constituents on goods across the board. Instead, I believe that we need to advance a common-sense, worker-focused trade agenda that combats China's anti-free market practices and ensures that our workforce, including our steel workers, can compete on a level playing field. That's why I was proud to reintroduce the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 with my colleague, Representative Van Duyn, yesterday. This bipartisan bill will modernize our anti-dumping and countervailing duty enforcement laws to push back against China's Belt and Road Initiative, combat China's circumvention of U.S. laws, and target repeat offenders. 2 weeks ago, I also joined with my colleagues, Dr. Murphy, as well as Representative Mike Boss, to introduce the bipartisan Fighting Trade Cheats Act, which we've discussed briefly in his comments, Dr. Murphy's comments a minute ago, which will increase the civil penalties for fraudulent and grossly negligent violations of our U.S. trade laws. I believe that both of these, the Leveling the Playing Field as well as the Fighting Trade Cheats Acts, are common sense, concrete solutions to protect American workers and to get tough on China's anti-market practices. Moreover, they are tools that are proven to work, and they won't hurt American consumers. Ms. Payesh, I wanted to ask you, can you expand upon how industries like steelworkers have been impacted by some of the current loopholes in our anti-dumping and countervailing duties laws? And do you think that the provisions of the Leveling the Playing Field 2.0 Act would help steelworkers in my district and across the United States in this regard?
Absolutely, and thank you, Representative Sewell, for your leadership in this area. This really gets at one of the emerging and greatest challenges in battling overcapacity in many sectors, but particularly in steel, driven by China. So we know that China, it's not market-based. It is a command-control economy that is looking to dominate in steel and as it is in other sectors. And so our companies, they invest in these cases, which are very expensive, takes months to move forward through the Department of Commerce, the International Trade Commission, in order to get those remedies in place, to show that they're being injured by subsidies, by dumping from these companies, from Chinese practices, and get those orders in place, those duties, high as 200% or more, which is the level of the unfair practice that they're facing. And what does China do? Well, it's very adept now at getting around these orders more and more on a faster and faster basis. So it's moving production to third countries, often in Asia, but in other locations as well. It's cross-subsidizing, so it's starting out in a third country where we don't have the orders in place. And then our companies have to start back at zero, and our workers are impacted in the meantime. It's not as if the injury stops as they bring these cases, it's ongoing.
Yep.
And so Leveling the Playing Field 2.0, it's getting at these very urgent issues and really promises to really help solve these problems and give us extra tools in our toolbox.
Ambassador Garish, you also talked about the Leveling the Playing Field 2.0, as well as most recently discussion about the Fighting the Cheats Act as well. Can you talk about why these are truly common sense, bipartisan solutions that we should prioritize as a committee, but definitely work with this administration in trying to implement?
Thank you. And again, Congresswoman Sewell, thank you for your leadership on this legislation, on Leveling the Playing Field Act and on the Fighting Trade Cheats Act. And I agree with my colleague, Ms. Payesh, on this. These are very much common sense actions to address the problems that we face. And, you know, I think what Ms. Payesh was describing was situations where we get trade remedies. Our companies, our workers get trade remedies against China, for instance. And what happens after that? They move their operations to a third country. And so these provisions would allow us to expedite successive investigations, address cross-border subsidies, and the distorted costs that often result as well, because these companies in third countries are often sourcing their inputs from China, or Chinese overcapacity is causing the entire cost structure to be distorted. So it allows commerce to go after particular market situations in a way that it was originally intended by the original legislation here, and also adjust costs in other instances as well. So it really enhances the remedies that are available to our companies and our workers in a very common sense way.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you. Hopefully we can have an opportunity to do a markup where we actually do prioritize these enforcement tools. I look forward to working in a bipartisan manner. Thank you.
Thank you. And I recognize Mr. Stubbe for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. U.S. trade policy must reflect not only economic interests, but our national security and ideological interests. I fully support President Trump standing up for this country through his trade policy. It's about time that we had a leader in the White House standing up for our interests and putting America first. Our allies must stand with us. It's not extremist to suggest that trade deals be fair, mutually beneficial, and accomplish measurable goals. If our friends to the north, south, and across the Atlantic and elsewhere choose to rip us off and compromise our own national security, then there are serious actions and consequences that need to happen. Last week, I introduced legislation to stop the importation of citrus from China entering the United States. The dumping from China is appalling and has had negatively impacted our domestic industry. Ambassador Jarish, what role do trade remedies like anti-dumping and countervailing duties play in protecting U.S. industries from unfair foreign competition? And are there any gaps in how these tools are currently applied?
Thank you, Congressman. And they serve an essential role in helping our companies and our workers to address unfair trade practices. They address instances where companies, including from China, are engaged in dumping in the United States, where they're unfairly pricing their products here many times below the costs of producing the products, and where those companies are unfairly subsidized by their foreign governments, and really provide a level playing field for our producers and workers here in the United States. And there are, unfortunately, there are limitations right now that need to be addressed, and many of those limitations are addressed in the Leveling the Playing Field Act legislation that we've been talking about, where we need to address this problem, where companies are moving to a third market and continuing to receive subsidies from their home government. In many instances, it's China, or there's real burdens to bringing successive investigations to address every time a company moves to a third country, and then there's more unfair trade that results from that. We need to address circumvention and evasion of the duties. Leveling the Playing Field Act does address circumvention. It puts very strict timelines on the proceedings. It also addresses evasion, requiring certification from importers to address the issue, as well as extending the Enforce and Protect Act to safeguard investigations. It requires minimum asset commitments by non-resident importers to address the problems we face. We also need reform of the Enforce and Protect Act. There are limitations to that, to the current system that we have. I've talked about some of them already, where we need to make companies that want to appeal the decisions by customs pay the duties before they can appeal. We need to give customs the ability to self-initiate investigations. So the burden is not just on U.S. companies to try to identify every single importer that is involved in these proceedings. Very often, that information is not available to U.S. companies, or they hide it through the use of shell companies. So that's a significant problem. So we need to continue to enhance the remedies that are available to us.
And what are countries like China doing to get around our trade laws?
They engage in a variety of very sophisticated practices. They're constantly engaging in practices like transshipping through third countries, where they falsely change the country of origin to avoid the payment of tariffs and anti-dumping and countervailing duties. They will misclassify the products to bring them outside of the coverage of the relief that's been imposed. They will undervalue the products to pay less in duties. They very often will set up operations in a third country to just completely try to avoid the payment of duties. So I think we really need to take action like the Leveling the Playing Field Act would provide for, but also directing our tariff actions at companies that are owned and controlled by Chinese companies, even in third countries. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal today about the fact that Chinese companies are already moving their operations to third countries to try to avoid the tariffs that have just recently been imposed and likely future tariffs.
Thank you. And in the limited time I have, Ambassador Dowd, I'm concerned that the EU games intellectual property rules to gain an unfair edge over American dairy products by using geographical indications to protect the names of generic dairy products. Do you think this is an issue the United States should prioritize in its trade agenda?
Absolutely. And in fact, Congresswoman Fischbaugh has sponsored the SAVE Act. We've done side letters with USMCA on common names. We've got a similar deal with Chile. This is something that we need to pursue with all of our trading partners.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Fischbach for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in Minnesota, and my district borders Canada, heavy ag district, we really do know how important those relationships with our Canadian neighbors are for business and for farms. However, I do think that our trade should at least be fair for our American producers. And you can probably guess I heard a lot about the dairy issues in USMCA in my district. Many of my farmers supported USMCA because they really thought that we needed to update those agricultural trade issues, and it's important that we increase the dairy market and the access to Canada. And like you mentioned, Ambassador Dowd, it is critically important that that American dairy producers have a fair opportunity to compete with, in particular here in neighboring Canada. And I am disappointed that Canada continues to keep U.S. producers from playing on a level field when it comes to filling the USMCA dairy tariff rate quotas. I have to slow down so I get all my words in. But Ambassador Dowd, I'm going to throw out a few questions really quickly, and I'd just like you to speak to some of that. Can you speak to the importance of access to foreign markets for U.S. agriculture, and how do exports relate to commodity prices? And then how can stepped-up trade enforcement ensure new and continued access to export markets? And I'm just going to throw that about 3.5 minutes, and you're going to cover all of that perfectly in that time.
Well, in dairy, 44% of our dairy goes to Canada and Mexico. So obviously USMCA is a critical thing. With the CAFTA DR on January 1, our tariff finally, after all these years, went to 0 for dairy. And I think to look at CAFTA DR and say, well, was that a success? Well, over these years, we've taken our dairy trade from 40 million to 440 million. So obviously these free trade agreements are a big deal. When we started with Mexico, it was 181 million in 1994. Today it's 2.5 billion. So obviously, number one, trade deals are very important. Number two, the next thing I would say is trade enforcement is critically important. The very first trade enforcement in the WTO was beef hormones with the EU. And going back to the EU, you mentioned them, very interesting situation where rather than fix the problem, they agreed to pay compensation. They've never fixed the problem. They have no interest in fixing the problem. They're protectionists. This is how they do business. And this is an incredibly difficult thing for U.S. farmers to have to deal with. We're very competitive in the world. In fact, that's part of the challenge is we scare other countries and their farmers about this. But I actually, last summer, had a very interesting conversation with the Chinese ambassador about this. And I said, our goal is to make the pie bigger, expand consumption of food around the world in hopes that we increase U.S. exports and U.S. trade of that consumption. So we're trying to increase trade, increase the diets of consumers around the world, increase protein, and that's our advantage in the U.S. is on the protein side.
And just maybe just comment on the effect on prices, on commodity prices, because that obviously that's a huge issue to everybody.
Well, I believe it was Senator Dole that once said in agriculture you have to sell it or smell it. And that's the way we look at it in agriculture. 18% of our dairy is exported. On the pork side, I think it's 25%. Beef is, 15 to 20%. Wheat is half. Soybeans. Everything that we do, we grow in abundance in this country. We're completely dependent on our ability to sell it to other customers around the world.
Well, and I appreciate that. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Snyder for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Sanchez for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. I just want to read a headline from this morning. That was New York Times, came across my phone. Americans are expecting higher prices. That could unnerve the Fed. More Americans are starting to brace for higher prices as President Trump's policies begin to take effect. I'm going to expand on that in a minute. Now, I do share many of the frustrations that some of my colleagues have articulated, most clearly Representative Panetta, where the last administration fell short in pursuing strategic trade agreements to benefit American exporters and American workers. Like Representative Del Bene, I joined with colleagues on both sides of the aisle when the last administration sought to take actions without direction or input from Congress. So I also share the great disappointment articulated today with the Republican majority in the House that seems quite content to abrogate our constitutional responsibilities to give them up to the executive branch. Now, the subject of this hearing today is about priorities. And at core, I think the trade priorities that we should be focusing on are fairly simple to state. Improving the lives of our citizens, economic growth, which includes raising wages and helping working families achieve financial security and building wealth, lowering the cost of living and bringing inflation down, greater access to global markets for American exporters, manufacturers, and farmers, creating more high-paying American jobs, and a stable supply chain, giving greater confidence to American manufacturers and American consumers. Unfortunately, this is not what the actions of the Trump administration are doing thus far. In fact, I don't think they've done anything to lower prices. Voters made clear last November that lowering prices was their #1 priority. But the tariffs being swung about like a giant battle axe against our most important trade partners will have the exact opposite effect. We saw the effect 8 years ago when retaliatory tariffs against the United States resulted in having to bail out our farmers. With the bombastic threats and actions emanating from the White House, we're going to see the cost of chaos again raising prices for American-made autos that depend on North American supply chains. Higher costs for home builders who are reliant on lumber from Canada. Higher food prices at the grocery store for fresh produce that consumers have come to expect to be available year-round. The President's recent trade announcements have caused costly uncertainty for small and medium-sized companies here in the United States who depend on access to global markets to sell their products and grow their businesses. These businesses need certainty to thrive, and that comes in the form of policy stability, a clear regulatory framework, and an equitable and transparent system to resolve trade disputes. The President's trade agenda has pointlessly rattled our trading system, demonstrating that his priorities are not focused on helping American workers and businesses. Now, I appreciate, Ambassador Dowd, your remarks on agriculture and dairy in particular. Last week, I sat down with a roundtable conversation with farmers in my district, and I was surprised to discover that in Lake County, Illinois, the biggest part of my district, there's only one dairy producer left operating. The conversation started out with one of the attendees noting that U.S. farmers are the most productive in the world and grow far more food than is necessary to feed our population. But here's the thing. Farming is a low-margin enterprise, and if American growers are excluded from export markets, many of their products, as you said, Ambassador Dowd, it's sell it or smell it, many of their products will be left either on the vine or in the fields, and many of these farms will either shut down or require, once again, another bailout. And of course, it's not just our dairy farmers that are facing challenges. Again, failing to focus on lowering costs and enhancing American exporters' access to markets means more economic pain for American workers and communities. The United States is strongest when we work with our partners and allies. And I agree with my colleagues today that we should prioritize trade enforcement and opportunities to open new markets for farmers and small businesses, sell American products around the world, and invest in trading systems that support both workers and businesses. That said, at this moment, I fail to see how upending decades of trade policy and going back on our word with our closest trading partners meets the moment. Instead of looking for ways to lower costs and using tariffs strategically, President Trump has altered the application of nearly every trade agreement the United States is a part of, and his actions threaten our country's position as a global leader. Putting tariff on our allies and retaliating against one of our most trusted trading partners through the usage of reciprocal tariffs will increase the cost of doing business with the United States. The President's actions will raise prices for nearly every industry across supply chains and fail to lower costs for American workers and families, and will not invest in our communities. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Now recognize Ms. Van Dyne for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Fair trade is the foundation of a strong American economy, but for too long our businesses and our workers have been forced to compete on an uneven playing field. Foreign competitors, particularly China, continue to exploit our trade laws and cheat the system by flooding our markets with subsidized goods, stealing intellectual property, and undercutting American industries. It's time that we confront these actions head-on and reverse the trend that we see caving to our adversaries. And I'm grateful for the return of American first policies. And I was glad to see that USTR and the Department of Commerce will be conducting a comprehensive review of all U.S. trade agreements, our tariffs, and economic policies to strengthen domestic industries and enhance national security. As has already been mentioned today, in response to concerns repeatedly expressed by our constituents, Representative Sewell and I, along with 29 of our colleagues in the House, reintroduced the Leveling the Playing Field 2.0 Act to equip companies and the Department of Commerce with the tools that they need to take on these bad actors. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous support to enter into record a letter of support from a variety of stakeholders whose industries would benefit from the bill.
Without objection.
Thank you. Our bill updates trade remedy law and creates new laws to combat repeat offenders, to expedite investigations and apply meaningful consequences, including going after Chinese subsidized manufacturing through the Belt and Road Initiative. Mr. Garish, as you outlined, so many of our global trading partners engage in trade practices and policies that harm American companies and workers. I'm also concerned about the impact of transnational subsidies and Chinese overcapacity in third country markets. It's clear these unfair trade practices make it a lot harder for American workers to compete. You mentioned support of our Leveling the Playing Field 2.0 Act. Can you expand on the importance of tackling cross-border subsidies and circumvention?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. It is an absolutely crucial piece of legislation, and it addresses many of the issues that our companies are experiencing and the problems that they face in trying to get adequate relief. You mentioned the cross-border subsidy provision. This is often a problem that we have where we get trade relief, our companies and the workers get trade relief, and then Chinese companies relocate to a third country, yet they continue to receive subsidies from their original home market, and that benefits their production and gives them an unfair advantage. And for too long, the United States has not addressed that issue. The Europeans do address cross-border subsidies. We should not be doing any less. We should be addressing this massive problem. The legislation also addresses this issue, this whack-a-mole issue, where we have to bring successive investigations where companies bounce around and move their operations. It expedites the proceedings and allows the International Trade Commission to consider the prior record from the prior investigation, which is critically important because otherwise our companies are expending too much money, too much resources to try to get trade relief against all the different sources of unfair trade. Right. It addresses the distortions that are resulting from this in costs as well, and addresses circumvention and evasion. It's a critical piece of legislation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And while trade with China has been a concern for President Trump and for members of this committee, trade with Mexico has also been under great scrutiny as well. Ms. Piesch, I'm deeply concerned about Mexico's commitment to upholding the rules of the USMCA framework. When we met with the former president, he told us that the U.S. misunderstood the USMCA as basically an excuse for being able to not uphold the letter of that doctrine. And so I'd like to hear your opinion. Is what is happening with the expropriation of Vulcan's materials property compliant with USMCA rules?
Thank you for the question. The circumstances of Vulcan and other issues, trade irritants we have with Mexico, sometimes they're complicated under the agreements. I can't speak directly to whether those activities are inconsistent with the agreement. What I would say is that the United States has a whole host of tools.
Oh, you're familiar with what happened, though?
Yes.
You had armed guards who came in the middle of the night, busted through their fences, and took over their property, and are basically now kicking them off after they'd spent hundreds of millions of dollars on creating, their port.
That's correct. The investment rules in USMCA have, of course, been were renegotiated from NAFTA and actually reduced in the process of those negotiations. So
but surely you're not suggesting that our USMCA agreement would have allowed this to happen to an American
I
company.
can't speak directly to that at this time. But there's a whole host of tools under the agreement, including the review that's coming up, where we can address anything that is not squarely covered under the agreement.
All right, thank you very much, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes Representative Miller.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Sanchez, and thank you all for being here today. Over the last 4 years, we've watched the Biden administration sit idly by as foreign nations launched a full-scale attack on American companies. I'm thankful that these days are over and we now have a president who will advocate for American businesses and engage with our allies and spur domestic manufacturing. Last Congress, I introduced the Protecting American Advanced Manufacturing Act to eliminate the access to American tax dollars that Chinese-linked manufacturers currently enjoy in the 45X manufacturing tax credit. 45X is the very credit meant to level the playing field for domestic manufacturing, and yet the Chinese companies continue to take American tax dollars, and we urgently need to address this. Another concern more directly related to this hearing is the very same Chinese-linked manufacturers who are circumventing tariffs and putting U.S. manufacturers at risk. The manufacturers in my district that produce aluminum, titanium, and steel have been victim to these tactics, as China ships considerable amounts of steel and aluminum through Mexico before entering the United States, effectively avoiding the tariffs imposed on these products. I am concerned that the plants that are in my district and around the country are being harmed as bad actors enter the U.S. by circumventing their products through other countries. Circumvention decreases the revenue we collect through tariffs and puts American jobs at risk in our market, as it is flooded unfairly and subsidized and with priced products. Ambassador Garish, how can the U.S. strengthen cooperation with allies and trading partners in order to prevent bad actors from using third countries to evade duties while we ensure compliance with our international trade commissioners?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I think there are several actions that we could take to get better cooperation from our trading partners. One is to establish customs cooperation agreements with our counterparts for customs and border protection in other countries to get them to crack down on transshipment. You're absolutely right. The problem with transshipment and evasion and other efforts to get around the duties is a significant problem. But we can have our customs authorities work with their customs authorities and try to get better cooperation in cracking down on these efforts. We made efforts to do that in the first Trump administration with Vietnam. Unfortunately, the problems with Vietnam have continued to a massive degree, and they continue to be a problem. Now, the other thing we can do, and this is, of course, more of a stick, but we can potentially do investigations under Section 301 to investigate the lack of action being taken by customs authorities, where it's they not only turn a blind eye, but maybe even facilitate the kinds of evasion and transshipment and circumvention practices that occur. And I think that should be something that another tool that should be applied to try to address this problem.
Thank you. And I'd like to now shift to digital trade. Trade partnerships are a two-way street, and I have serious concerns that some of our partners aren't holding up their end of the bargain. Last Congress, I introduced the U.S. Republic of Korea Digital Trade Enforcement Act that protects American digital companies if Korea passes a law that harms digital businesses. It's my understanding that the Republic of Korea is still pursuing this legislation, albeit under the guise of a so-called ex post framework that covertly still targets specific U.S. companies. Mr. McHale, do you believe both the Online Platform Monopoly Regulation Act and the Korean Fair Trade Commissioner's ex post approach amount to discrimination against U.S. companies? And do you believe that the Trump administration should seek trade and other enforcement remedies to ensure this type of Korean discrimination against the U.S. company no longer occurs?
Thank you. Yes. The short answer is yes. If you look at the service definitions and the thresholds that the Korea Fair Trade Commission's proposal institutes, both are clearly aimed at targeting U.S. firms. Even though some Korean companies may be swept in, the key question is, does it put the U.S. firms at a competitive disadvantage when competing in the market? What we've seen is that Chinese companies are rapidly coming into the market. I think the revenues are now up to $2 billion a year. They would not fall within the thresholds or service definitions from what I understand. So U.S. companies are competing against both Korean companies and Chinese companies in the market based on specific definitions that are subject through this proposed law to fines, prohibited conduct, and injunctive action that are not applicable to their competitors. For me, that looks like discrimination.
Thank you. I yield back. I've run out of time.
Gentlewoman yields. Is the gentleman from Texas ready? You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thanks to our witnesses for their testimony. But, Madam Chairman, I just don't believe that this committee can continue to operate with business as usual while the government all around us is enveloped with chaos, with destruction, and illegality. Our international trade agreements are being shredded by Donald Trump, the greater appeaser, too weak in his ability to stand up to Vladimir Putin. American farmers are suffering, while so many that they would normally feed go hungry from Trump's illegal shutdown. And Trump's grocery tax, delayed for a few short weeks, will now be hitting American consumers this weekend. This hearing attempts to deny what our eyes can clearly see. The emperor has no clothes. The trade policy of our self-proclaimed king, Donald Trump, is no policy at all. It's only threats, reversals, and lies. Trump is driven by his top priority, which is new tax breaks for billionaires, passing the buck to defending our country, to working families, requiring families to pay far more in the form of higher prices on their goods, whether it's groceries or something else. Last week on Fox, Trump's Commerce Secretary confirmed this reality by stating that Trump's plan was to abolish the IRS and replace it with tariffs, tariffs that today provide about 2% of the revenues of the federal government. Never mind that this plan, in the words of the very conservative Tax Foundation, is a, quote, mathematical impossibility. Our overall level of trade is too small, and the grocery tax working families would be required to pay is far, far too high for this scheme to ever work. Nevertheless, our self-proclaimed very stable genius president is pushing forward by firing 6,500 IRS workers responsible for tax enforcement, and today the Congress is about to vote on Trump's one beautiful bill, his solution to the phony Republican concern about our soaring national debt. The king of debt, in fact, will approve adding about $4 trillion to the national debt with this bill. Those who will be harmed by the chaotic desire to slap a tariff on everything and anything are working families looking for a little help with rising costs. I am reminded, you've got to put the right chart up. Sorry. Well, I'm reminded of Trump's comments in recent months about what he would do about grocery prices. He told us that starting on day one, we'll end inflation and make America affordable again. He told us as recently as January the 7th, we're going to have prices down. I think you're going to see some pretty drastic price reductions. Well, if anybody can find those reductions, I'd like to know about it. What is drastic is the approach that's being taken with this Republican budget and the fact that beginning this weekend, my Texas consumers who rely on Mexican produce will pay 25% more as a result of his new Trump tariff tax. And for our nation's farmers, his tariffs promise only more pain. The type of pain they got during the first Trump administration when taxpayers were out billions of dollars for farm welfare payments when farmers lost their foreign markets. As the president of the Illinois Farm Bureau recently said, our farmers simply cannot afford the uncertainty of a potential trade war. And it's the same story for the people in my area that are struggling over high housing prices. Trump totally ignored the warning of the National Association of Home Builders that if tariffs would, quote, ultimately be passed on to home buyers in the form of increased housing prices and would disrupt supply chains, which will delay building. And what about American workers? While promising us economic pain, we have yet to see Trump release any credible plan for bringing good manufacturing jobs back to the United States. I've been critical in the past of both Democratic and Republican administrations for not vigorously enforcing our trade agreements, particularly with respect to the environment, to prevent a global race to the bottom. But the destructive chaos that is Trump's tariff policy, driven as it is by the desire to raise costs for working families in order to give billionaires another tax break, is no response to the perceived lack of trade enforcement, either real or imagined. And we must continue to focus on those wrongs instead of the illusion that occurred through much of today's hearing. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I just want to say thank you to the panel, particularly I am privileged to represent New York's 24th District in upstate New York, a very large and sprawling district all the way from the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Niagara River down to the southern tier. And I represent the 5th largest dairy district in the entire country, the largest agricultural district in the Northeast, and the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution along the Erie Canal corridor. And for decades, U.S. trade policy has allowed other countries to take advantage of American farmers and businesses without repercussion. Under President Trump's leadership, America has finally fought back against these horrendous policies that have hollowed out America's critical industries, inhibited America's farmers access to global markets. I wholly support these efforts and applaud President Trump for his America First trade policy memorandum issued on the first day of his administration, requiring a wholesale review of U.S. trade policy and ensuring it supports U.S. interests and national security to benefit American workers, farmers, and businesses. And so with this dairy state of mind, I'd like to direct my first question to Ambassador Dowd. You highlighted how Canada has repeatedly failed to comply with its USMCA dairy market access commitments, which has left many of the dairy tariff rate quotas unfilled every year since its implementation. And while I strongly support the underlying principles of USMCA for its updated roles, coming off the old trade bill, and especially when it comes to agricultural, the promises of ensuring U.S. dairy access to Canadian markets, Canada has continued to abuse the system and restrict U.S. access to Canadian markets for dairy. And I strongly disagree, and I know you do, with the dispute settlement panel decisions last November that Canada is actually not breaching its USMCA commitments. I shall turn you over to every dairy farmer in my district who will tell you they disagree as well. Can you just elaborate real quickly on how the United States should address this issue and ensure that our New York dairy producers have the full benefit of the USMCA regarding this particular powdered milks? You can talk about whatever the issues are. I hear about them every day from our farmers.
Yes, Congresswoman, thank you. Yeah, there are two issues. It's in how Canada administers its tariff rate quotas. They're very good at allocating those to processors, which are really, in essence, competitors, rather than allocating those to food service and retailers where they would be willing to actually utilize U.S. product. Then in terms of their overproduction or abundance of skim milk powders that they sell in the third country markets, we address that in USMCA and have restrictions on that in terms of their Class 7, but they've, the term we used earlier here in the hearing was move the cheese on us, and they've slid this over into a different class to try to push more of that product into the U.S. and elsewhere. This is the reason that Ambassador Lighthizer wanted to have a situation where every so often you renegotiate and you sat down and had conversations about our trade agreements. I think it's a very good thing to do, and this gives us an opportunity in this case with Canada to sit down and
well, what specifically do you think the President should do, or the USTR and our team should do right now in dealing with this issue? It's affecting us every day.
Well, I think, we have to continue to lean on. There was a term used earlier about rattling cages. and I think from my perspective in agriculture, all the easy stuff was done a long time ago in trade. We rattled cages the first time around, the two of us, to great effect with regard to China and USMCA and Japan. And I'd like to see us do that again, Canada, and in particular with the European Union.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, my next question, I want to talk to Mr. Garish just real quickly, Ambassador Garish. Look, my district, again, I talked about the Erie Canal. We are home to some of the most important copper fabricators in the entire nation. Paul Revere started his copper business in what was now my old district, but in my region. Really important that we talk about dealing with the tariffs when it comes to the ability of China to dump, into the region. Now, I'm going to fully acknowledge that we've had some issues over the years. A lot of the smelting plants have been moved overseas. They're not available. Many of our copper suppliers are required to work with Canada. I know that these have been paused, some of the tariffs on Canada, particularly dealing with some of our copper manufacturers. Can you tell me how the Trump administration can best combat the Chinese efforts to undermine our critical U.S. industries like copper, and also how we can, I know I'm running out of time, but quickly just state how we can deal with this issue with Canada and getting, smelting and getting our supply chains back here. And a lot of our copper fabricators support bringing the supply chains back, but it can't be done overnight. Could you maybe address that real quickly?
Sure, and thank you, Congresswoman. And I think, there are a number of things that the Trump administration can do. They can enhance the enforcement of anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws to address the unfair trade by China, and that can, in turn, help with supply chains here in North America as well, and I think that it will have carry-on benefits from that. And also, I think, increasing enforcement of the Phase 1 agreement and imposing tariffs on Chinese imports for its violations of the Phase 1 trade agreement can also address the problems with Chinese imports. And addressing evasion of Chinese imports, or getting around the various tariff and trade enforcement efforts that are engaged in by Chinese companies. So there's a variety of efforts that they can employ, and I think there will be very much enhanced trade enforcement going forward.
We appreciate that. I mean, these are significant. I don't want to forget the aluminum processing plants, some of them right in my own district, too. We know that these supply chains need to come back, and we're very committed to that. We want to make sure that we're just continuing to move in that direction. We have a great opportunity to have a rebirth. Do you? Thank you so much, and I'm going to yield back my time to myself and recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an important hearing today. I want to say first, obviously, we have great American workers, producers, manufacturers, and company that create wonderful products, and they are interested in having markets available around the world, so it's an important discussion. Starting with the America First Trade Policy Memorandum, President Trump has shown that he's going to undertake a comprehensive review of our existing trade policies to ensure that we have fair market access for those products and for our industries. And I will say that we, as you've heard today, congressional Republicans are ready to work with the President to hold our trading partners accountable and enforce a level playing field. I have a number of topics that are specific to my district. Some you've already touched on. One is regarding dairy, and I appreciate Congresswoman Tenney bringing that up. I serve Pennsylvania's 11th congressional district, which is the largest dairy producer in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and also the 10th largest in the country. So dairy, very important. And you've already talked a little bit about it, Ambassador Dowd, but wondering if you could talk about the real impact on American farmers if we don't get this right, if Canada continues to go against the spirit of the USMCA in regards to its dairy policy.
Well, I think it has a particular impact in New York and Pennsylvania because that's where the people in Canada are. Everybody, in the Toronto area, Ontario, that's where the folks live there, and so that's our natural market just as much as it is, to our population centers in the U.S. But if I would, I want to make particular emphasis on the European Union with regard to dairy as well. We've talked today about the lack of ability to export this. We provide the European Union country-specific TRQ into the U.S. they don't give us any leeway in that regard as well. There's so many certification requirements, process requirements. Now they're talking about, in your part of the world, Congressman, the European unions want to come on farm and interview our farm workers is a discussion with regard to whether or not they're going to trade with us. The list goes on, and it's high time that we engage with the Europeans on this subject of ag trade.
Yeah, definitely agree. Avian influenza is, of course, my district is the largest egg-producing district in the country, I believe, and so avian influenza has considerable impact. We're all, of course, concerned about the price of eggs, and one of the things we could do is vaccines. I'm just curious. This may not even necessarily be trade-related, but there's been a sort of a policy not to do the vaccines because of potential impact on trade for the broilers for meat. But yet, France and other countries have had the vaccine for a while, so I think it's probably time, and I know the administration is working on this, that we allow vaccinations for at least our layers. Just wondering whether you had any thought on that.
Congressman, this is a big issue for us in the dairy industry, and we are very supportive of vaccines. Zoetis has got one coming. We just heard today that Elanco is working on one, and there are trade implications to this, and this is a very important point. To the best of my understanding, Congressman, these vaccines are differentiated vaccines. The term is DIVA vaccines, means that you can tell the difference from an animal that's been vaccinated versus occurring and got the virus in the wild. And being able to differentiate one from the other solves the trade issue. It allows our trading partner to say, no, that's a vaccinated, bird or whatever it is, versus what goes on from getting the actual virus. That should resolve the trade issues as we develop these what they call DIVA vaccines.
Anybody else care to weigh in on that at all? I don't know. Okay. No? All right. Also, been concerned with actions taken by some of our closest allies like Canada to impose local content requirements for online streaming platforms. Last Congress, I co-led a letter with Congresswoman Sanchez to USTR asking for increased oversight on this issue. And so I was pleased to see President Trump highlight that as a matter to investigate recently. Mr. McHale, are these requirements structured to specifically target American companies, do you think? And how are American artists and companies harmed by this unequal treatment?
They're absolutely targeting U.S. firms. I think the bulk of the payments will land on U.S. streaming companies. What I think is particularly unfortunate is the U.S. streaming companies are actually a platform that helps Canadian artists and producers export to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a double whammy where we're helping the Canadians actually do something helpful, and yet we're being taxed in order to do that. The agreement does prohibit, the rule prohibits discrimination on the basis of nationality, which is how they're implementing this. And so I do think it does require investigation and action.
Sure. Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for their time and testimony here today. Today, this committee examines an essential pillar of Americans' economic strategy, trade enforcement policy. Ensuring fair trade is not just about protecting American industry, it's about defending our workers, strengthening our businesses, and securing long-term economic growth and security. For too long, we've seen other countries, China, chief among them, engage in unfair trade practices consistently, whether through state-backed subsidies, forced technology transfers, and intellectual property theft, burdensome regulations, and outright non-compliance with existing trade agreements. They've manipulated the system to their advantage, and they consistently once again do this like clockwork. While the United States has had strong enforcement tools at our disposal, the question here is whether we are utilizing them effectively and adapting to new threats of a rapidly changing global economy. Trade agreements play a crucial role in leveling the playing field for American businesses, reducing trade deficits, and ensuring that United States exports and imports compete under fair and enforceable rules. When these agreements are effectively negotiated and enforced, they provide manufacturers, farmers, and service providers with access to new markets while safeguarding against unfair competition. Strong enforcement of trade agreements is critical to prevent bad actors from exploiting loopholes, undercutting American industries, and harming our economic stability, which I believe Canada and Mexico have negated the USMCA agreement with corn GMO down south and with 318% dairy tariffs on us here in the United States. From day one, President Trump has made it clear that the era of unchecked, unfair trade practices is over, thankfully. Under his leadership, we have demanded a more balanced trade agenda committed to expanding market access for American farmers and manufacturers, and have worked to restore our position as a global economic leader. Ambassador Dowd, it's great to see you again. Hope you're doing well. Last year, I joined several colleagues in a letter calling on the Biden administration to address the growing agricultural trade deficit I had just mentioned beforehand. I'm concerned with the treatment of American exports, especially the challenges facing dairy products exported to Canada and the EU. As you noted in your comments earlier, the United States currently has a dairy trade deficit of nearly $3 billion alone with the EU. Can you speak a bit more about the structural trade barriers that are driving these massive deficits, and what role can new enforceable trade agreements play in addressing these market access barriers?
Well, there is no question that the EU treats us poorly in agriculture and has for a long time. They have subsidies, protectionism. It isn't just that you have to meet the standard in terms of food safety or whatever it is to get into Europe. You also have to meet the process, the protocol, and every step along the way in the process. And if you don't follow every step in their process, then you don't have access. And it's just unbridled protectionism, really, at the end of the day. It has been the case. We've been having this conversation since the 1980s, the Uruguay round. We've always talked about subsidies in Europe, and now they're not shy about it anymore. They just make it clear that, if we come up with a way in dairy to meet some of their processes and their requirements and their standards, all of a sudden they come up with new ones. They move things around to prevent us from having access.
Yeah. So they continue to move the goalpost back an extra 5 yards.
They're always moving the goalposts in agriculture, and I think my frustration is, in 32 years in Washington, we've always let them. So from this notion of a reciprocal trade relationship, we have a $26 billion trade deficit in agriculture with the European Union. We have a $3 billion trade deficit in dairy with the European Union. We are exactly what the president is discussing in agriculture and the trading relationship in ag between the U.S. and the EU.
Yeah, and all we're trying to do is get our allies to uphold to the same agreement that they already signed willingly, just to operate in good faith, which is incredibly sad that they've decided to negate those agreements. Thank you for the response to that question, Ambassador, and it's great to see you again. I'm going to try to get this in quick. If not, we can submit it for the record. To the panel, starting with you, Ambassador Garish, what additional tools should Congress consider to more effectively address and target specific trade distortions, such as concerns from industrial overcapacity and digital service barriers, and which tools can ensure a fair playing field for American businesses?
Thank you, Congressman. And first and foremost, I would say passing the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. It addresses a number of the problems that you're mentioning specifically. And among other things, we've talked about some here today, but it addresses the cross-border subsidies, allows commerce to apply countervailing duties to subsidies that are provided by one government to a company in a third country. It addresses the problem of country hopping, where we have to our companies and workers have to bring multiple investigations to try to address unfair trade. It addresses the distortions that result to costs in various markets, from the overcapacity problems in China, for instance. And it allows us to adjust costs, or would allow commerce to adjust costs where there's been distortions due to dumped, subsidized imports or inputs that are coming from non-market economies as well. So that's an essential set of tools that addresses circumvention and evasion as well. We also need reforms to the Enforce and Protect Act to greater address the problems with duty evasion that we're experiencing through transshipment or misclassification as well. At this point, companies are just setting up these shell companies and these elaborate operations to try to get around the duties. We need to take stronger enforcement action there.
And we'll get there. Thank you, Ambassador. I'm way over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. I'd like to thank the witnesses for appearing today. We really appreciate your testimony. We know this is a really important issue. Thank the ranking member and everyone here who have been terrific. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.